Chapter 1086. Although it was necessary to verify one's identity through a personal terminal when entering the core area, thanks to the chaotic flow of people, the so-called sword-bearers could not even keep up with the flow of people in the dojo, so the verification of the sword-bearer's identity was completely suspended. In the minds of these guards, it was impossible for Yuan Ko to pass through the dimensional wall system, so the identity verification was just superfluous. After entering the core area, Gahan saw people constantly directing the crowd, and at the same time, letting the sword-bearers head to the wall of the core area to provide sword essence to the core area's dimensional wall system, helping the core area's dimensional wall system resist the dragon's attack. However, Gohan was very clear that the core area's dimensional wall system was far inferior to the superdimensional wall system, and there was also a limit to the flow of sword essence. The core area's dimensional wall system's replenishment rate of sword essence could not keep up with the rate of energy consumption. In less than 4 or 5 days, the core area's dimensional wall system would completely collapse, just like the superdimensional wall system outside. More importantly, when the superdimensional wall system of Yuzhong City collapsed, it was impossible for those big forces of Yuan Ko who had been lurking in the dark to not notice it. They would definitely flock to Yuzhong City from all directions, and in less than half a day, the Yuan Ko army would arrive. The core area's dimensional wall system's energy consumption rate would also greatly increase. By that time, let alone 4 or 5 days, it might not even be able to last half a day. Lu Shihua. Gahan instinctively wanted to contact Lu Shihua through his personal terminal, but when his fingers touched his wrist, he found that his personal terminal had been destroyed in his hand. Gahan could no longer get in touch with others. Forget it. It's the same if I go to the sword pavilion alone. Gu Xinyuan gave up the idea of contacting Lu Shihua and walked in the direction of the sword pavilion alone. When Gahan once again came to the sword pavilion that he had not seen for 3 years, Gahan felt very emotional. He did not know how Lu Shihua was managing the sword pavilion. It must be very hard for her to run it alone. However, when Gahan arrived at the entrance of the sword pavilion, he suddenly discovered that the door was tightly shut. This caused Gahan's expression to change abruptly. Although Yuzhong City was in danger, according to the rules, unless the core of Yuzhong City had been invaded by Yuan Ko, the gate of the sword garret was not allowed to be closed. But at this moment, the gate of the sword pavilion was closed and locked by an electronic lock. Did something bad happen to the sword pavilion? Who are you? What are you doing at the entrance of the sword pavilion? Just as Gahan was feeling puzzled, a questioning voice came from behind Gahan. Gahan turned his head to take a look. It was an acquaintance of Gahan's. It was the practical training teacher who had once sent Gahan to the hospital during the practical training course at Yuzhong University. It was Li Xian. When Gu Xianyuan turned her head and revealed her true appearance, Li Xian was shocked. He didn't expect such a beautiful woman to exist in this world. This woman was more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. Perhaps only the legendary 4 most beautiful sword maidens could compete with this woman in terms of beauty. While Li Xian was immersed in Gu Xuanyuan's beauty, Gahan also noticed that there were still only 2 scabbards hanging on Li Xian's waist. Almost 4 years had passed, but Li Xian was still a sword wielder of the sword pavilion. He had not improved at all. So it's teacher Li Xian. When he saw Li Xian, Gahan hesitated for a moment before addressing him as teacher, who said that this teacher had almost killed him, but he was still his teacher in the past. There was a world of difference between Gahan's current strength and that of 3 years ago. The Gahan of 3 years ago might have made things difficult for Li Xian when he saw him again. However, the current Gahan had already gotten over it. He could not be bothered to deal with Li Xian and Lu Chan anymore. Moreover, the current Gahan was not Gahan, but Gu Xianyuan. You know me? And you call me teacher? Li Xian was shocked. Why don't I remember? Do I have such a beautiful student like you? I didn't expect teacher Li Xian to still be so lecherous after not seeing him for 7 or 8 years. Gu Xianyuan said bluntly. I didn't expect you to remember all this. Li Xian smiled awkwardly. You definitely won't be able to guess what I went through after that. Actually, I'm no longer a teacher now. I was chased out of Yuzhong University 3 years ago. Now, I'm a warrior. It's easier and more comfortable for me to fight and kill outside. Oh, Gu Xianyuan replied. That. Speaking of which, aren't you curious why I was chased out of Yuzhong University? Li Xian felt a little uncomfortable when he saw how calm Gu Xianyuan was. According to Li Xian's original plan, this beautiful girl, who was his former student, would definitely ask him about the reason why he was chased out of Yuzhong University after he told her about his tragic experience. Then, he would be able to talk a lot with this beautiful girl and tell her about his tragic experience. It might even inspire his former student to feel pity for him, which would then lead to a deeper relationship. However, Gu Xianyuan was so calm, as if she was not curious about why he had been chased out of Yuzhong University. This made Li Xian feel very pained. It was like having a fishbone stuck in his throat. Li Xian felt uncomfortable if he did not spit it out. I think I should tell you about it. It happened 3 years ago. I taught a class, but an accident happened in that class. A sword-wielding student with no abilities at all almost died in the hands of a tiger-rank Yuan Ko. I was scolded by the dean. I couldn't take it anymore, so I took the initiative to resign. Li Xian sighed and said with a sorrowful look. Then, he looked at the beautiful student, Gu Xianyuan, with a face full of anticipation, hoping that she could comfort him. Is the student that teacher Li Xian mentioned called Gahan? Gahan could not be bothered to deal with this lecherous guy anymore, so he asked straightforwardly, "How did you know?" Li Xian was so scared that his eyeballs were about to fall out of their sockets. Only a few people in Yuzhong City knew about this. Guhan is my biological brother. Teacher Li Xian, how do you think I know? Gu Xianyuan said coldly. It's over. I actually bumped into Guhan's biological sister. Li Xian's entire body immediately shrank. It was only then that Li Xian noticed that there were 3 scabbards hanging on Gu Xuanyuan's waist. He was surprised to find out that she was actually a famed sword-rank sword-wielder. The lecherous thoughts in his heart were instantly extinguished. What a joke. Gahan, that pervert, had already become a famed sword-rank sword-wielder 3 years ago. His sister must also be a pervert. He could not fall into the hands of the Gu family again. Therefore, Li Xian smiled awkwardly and prepared to sneak out of the place. Wait. Unexpectedly, Gu Xianyuan called out to Li Xian. Teacher Li Xian, what happened back then is in the past. Gahan said that he doesn't blame you for a long time. Let's just pretend that it never happened. The 2 of us will definitely not take revenge on you because of that. Is that so? Li Xian immediately heaved a sigh of relief when he heard Gu Xuanyuan's words. However, Teacher Li Xian, I have something to ask you. Why is the Sword Tower's main door locked now? The dimensional barrier in the core area is clearly still there. Gu Xianyuan finally found an acquaintance and asked directly, Your younger brother was the previous Sword Tower Master? How could you not know what happened in the Sword Tower? Li Xian asked with a puzzled look. I've always been fighting in Yanjing City, and I rarely cared about my younger brother's matters. My younger brother never told me about his matters either. It was only when my younger brother went missing that I had no choice but to return to Yuzhong City to deal with some matters. So what's wrong with the Sword Tower? Where's the Sword Tower Master here? My younger brother's disciple, Lu Shihua. Gu Xianyuan asked continuously. Sai, speaking of the current Sword Tower Master, your younger brother's disciple is really pitiful. He clearly doesn't have much strength, but your younger brother forcefully placed him in the position of Sword Tower Master. I really don't know what your younger brother is thinking. Li Xian sighed and then continued, Beautiful lady, don't blame me, Li Xian. To be honest, your younger brother has really done a terrible job in this matter. You don't know what kind of life Lu Shihua has been living for the past 3 years. What kind of life has she been living? Upon hearing Li Xian's words, Guhan's heart felt as if it had been firmly grasped by a hand and instantly twisted into a fried dough twist. The decision he had made 3 years ago had been too rash and impulsive. Gahan knew this very well. In the beginning, there were all sorts of curses and rumors. They all said that Lu Shihua had used her beauty to seduce your younger brother, causing him to pass the position of Sword Tower Master to her. This caused Lu Shihua to become synonymous with the word slut in Yuzhong City. Beautiful lady, you are also a woman. You should know how great the damage such rumors caused to Lu Shihua. I heard that during that period of time, Lu Shihua was scolded so badly by the rumors that she wanted to commit suicide by cutting her wrists several times. Later, I don't know who gave Lu Shihua the idea to take the initiative to go to the hospital for a checkup. At the same time, she had the highest level of artificial intelligence supervise the entire process. The highest level of artificial intelligence proved that she was still a virgin. Only then did the rumors gradually die down. But that was just the beginning. More terrible things happened to your younger brother's disciple, Li Xian said with a sad expression. Chapter 1087. After Lu Shihua proved his innocence, there was a huge wave of resignations in the sword pavilion. Li Xian sighed and said, those sword wielders who originally worked in the sword pavilion said that they did not want to be led by an ancient sword rank sword wielder, so they all resigned and left the sword pavilion. In the end, there were less than a tenth of the original sword bearers left in the sword pavilion, and it was said that the tenth of the sword bearers had a bad work attitude. They turned a deaf ear to the sword pavilion master's orders and spent their days in the sword pavilion. In the end, all the work in the sword pavilion fell to Lu Shihua alone. She was busy in and out of the sword pavilion every day. I heard that she had not left the sword pavilion for more than a year. Later, Lu Shihua recruited many ordinary people into the sword pavilion and then took the initiative to dismiss all the sword bearers in the sword pavilion. Only then did the work in the sword pavilion return to normal. However, the sword committee immediately told Lu Shihua that the conflict between the sword bearers and ordinary people in Yuzhong City was more intense. They hoped that there would be a sword bearer with status to preside over the conflict between the ordinary people and the sword bearers. Who else but your brother's disciple, Lu Shihua, could be appointed as the chairman of the Yuzhong City Mediation Committee? Lu Shihua was appointed as the chairman of the Yuzhong City Mediation Committee, responsible for mediating the various conflicts between the ordinary people and the sword bearers. Beauty, you know that the most painful thing in the world is to mediate disputes between people. Back then, your brother almost got locked up in prison for killing an ordinary person. It took him dozens of days to calm down. However, Lu Shihua has to deal with more than 10 such disputes every day. I heard that in the first month of her appointment, she lost more than 10 kilograms. Half of her hair turned white. She only sleeps for 3 to 4 hours a day. She looks like she has aged more than 10 years. She's so pitiful. Sigh. Following that, Li Xian told Gu Xianyuan a lot about how pitiful Lu Shihua was. Gu Xianyuan could not help but clench her fists as she listened. There were many reasons why Lu Shihua was so pitiful. One of them was because of his cold body, and the other was because of the sword association. Could it be that this group of bastards wanted to cripple a future sword emperor? Let me ask you, do you know which ancient sword rank sword mistress Lu Shihua has? Gu Xianyuan could not help but ask this question. If the people of Yuzhong City knew that Lu Shihua's sword lady was the double-winged angel sword, and that he would definitely become an emperor sword wielder in the future, would the people of Yuzhong City still dare to treat Lu Shihua like this? Would those people from the Sword Council continue to torture Lu Shihua like this? I know, it's the two-winged angel sword, right? To Gohan's surprise, Li Xian actually knew that Lu Shihua's sword mistress was the double-winged angel sword. In other words, everyone in Yuzhong City knew that Lu Shihua was a future emperor sword wielder. Why did everyone still treat Lu Shihua this way? Speaking of which, it's such a pity. Sigh. Our Yuzhong City could have had an emperor sword wielder, but who would have thought that we'd lose the four-winged angel sword? At this point, Li Xian's face trembled in pain. It was obvious that he was pained that Yuzhong City had lost an emperor sword rank. What's going on? How could he have lost the four-winged angel sword? Wasn't it kept in Yinjing City's sword tower? How could he have lost it? Gu Xianyuan asked agitatedly. Beauty, you're from Yinjing City. You don't even know this? Li Xian revealed a surprised expression. 3 years ago, when Sword Immortal Cloud Sky passed away, something big happened in Yinjing City. Sword Immortal Tian Zi suddenly brought the sword mistress from Yinjing City's sword tower and rebelled. However, they were stopped by Hao Tianjindi on the way. Hao Tianjindi also snatched the dimensional pocket that sword immortal Tianzi had on him. Then, he used his emperor blood to open the sword purification pool and forcefully opened sword immortal Tianzi's dimensional pocket. He took back the sword mistress that sword immortal Tianzi had taken away. However, he didn't expect that there would only be about 90% of the sword mistresses in the dimensional pocket. About 10% of the natural sword mistresses were taken away by sword immortal Tianzi. The entire Yinjing city went crazy with anger, and the four-winged angel sword was among the sword mistresses that were lost. Sigh. If Pavilion Master Lysia doesn't have the four-winged seraphim sword, it's impossible for him to become a saber-class sword wielder. Even if he still has the 6-winged, 8-winged, 10-winged, and 12-winged seraphim swords, it's useless. Without the 4-winged seraphim sword, Pavilion Master Lysia is destined to be an ancient sword wielder for the rest of his life. Therefore, even though Pavilion Master Lu Shihua had already revealed her 2-winged angel sword when Sword Immortal Cloud Sky passed away and shocked the other sword bearers, the Sword Council also spent a lot of time trying to please her. However, once they realized that the 4-winged angel sword was gone, Pavilion Master Lu Shihua's situation completely fell to the bottom. He was like an angel that had been banished to the mortal world. In just a few words, Li Xian revealed a piece of shocking news that Gahan had never heard before. No wonder the Sword Council dared to treat Lu Shihua like this. It turned out that in their eyes, Lu Shihua had lost his value as half a Jindi. Instead, he was a sword wielder who was destined to be an ancient sword wielder for the rest of his life. Why didn't I know about such an important matter? Gu Xinyuan was completely dumbfounded when she heard the news. How was it possible that she did not know about such an important piece of news? It's not surprising that you didn't know, beautiful. There is still some sword wielder who don't know about this. Li Xian quickly explained when he heard Gu Xinyuan mumbling to herself. It's fine that Yinjing City has been humiliated, but what's more terrifying is that they've lost 1/10 of their natural sword ladies. They don't dare to announce this important news to ordinary people. Otherwise, the entire Yinjing City will be in an uproar. Therefore, the Sword Council has ordered that this matter is strictly prohibited from spreading among ordinary people. At the same time, it's strictly prohibited from spreading on the internet. There's not even a bit of news about this matter on the internet. It's only been told to the higher-ups of the sword wielder in the various base cities. Although it's not prohibited among sword wielder, the Sword Council has also stipulated that unless the other party takes the initiative to ask, they are absolutely not allowed to mention this matter. At the same time, they have to inform ordinary people. Otherwise, they will all be locked up and suffer grievances. Now, 3 years have passed. Although some of the sword wielder have found out about this news through various channels, and the ban itself is gradually loosening and is no longer as strict as before, about half of the sword wielder still don't know about this important piece of news. Especially those sword wielder who have been fighting outside for the past 3 years. It's impossible for them to know about this news. It seems like you've been fighting to the death with Yuan Ko for the past 3 years. Beautiful. Otherwise, it's impossible for you not to know about such important news. I've indeed been fighting outside for the past 3 years. Gu Xinyuan sighed. Based on the timeline, this incident happened when she was in Shanhaiguan. Shanhaiguan could only communicate with the outside world through the internet. Therefore, once this matter was banned from spreading on the internet, it was impossible for Gahan to find out about it through public channels. He could only wait for his friends to take the initiative to tell him. However, at that time, he happened to be cultivating in seclusion in the game. He took the initiative to block all communication with the outside world for about a year. Therefore, even if someone wanted to tell him about this news during this period, he wouldn't be able to receive it. When he ended his seclusion, this matter gradually became old news. No one thought of telling him anymore. In the end, he forcibly kept it a secret for 3 years. But what about Lu Shihua? He and Lu Shihua had been in contact for the past 3 years. Why didn't she tell him about such an important matter? Didn't she know to complain to her master? In fact, Gohan knew very well that Lu Shihua must have been worried that telling him about this would distract him in the dangerous Shanhaiguan. Therefore, she would rather bear all of this alone than tell him the truth. While Gahan was greatly moved by this, he also hated himself even more for putting Lu Shihua in the position of Sword Pavilion Master, which was not suitable for her in the first place. Why did Sword Immortal Tian Hong betray humanity? He, an immortal sword-tier swordsman, betrayed humanity for no reason. Wait, you're saying that the swordsman who betrayed humanity is Sword Immortal Tian Hong? At this moment, Gahan suddenly remembered. Wasn't Sword Immortal Tian Hong the immortal sword-tier swordsman who died in the hands of Medusa? Guhan had seen his corpse before. It was clear that he could not be any more dead. How could he possibly betray humanity? There's something wrong here. There must be a big problem here. Guhan muttered to himself, but for a moment, Guhan couldn't figure out what the problem was. Although the news of Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death had been hidden from the ordinary people and some of the swordsmen, it was not a secret among the swordsmen in Yanjing City. A large number of swordsmen already knew about Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death before Gahan entered Shanhaiguan. In that case, wouldn't these swordsmen find it strange when they heard that Sword Immortal Tian Hong had betrayed humanity? Wouldn't they be curious about why a dead person could betray humanity? It seemed that even if this traitor wasn't Sword Immortal Tian Hong, he must be closely related to Sword Immortal Tian Hong. Could it be that Sword Immortal Tian Hong didn't really die back then and was only faking his death? Thinking about it that way, it wasn't impossible. After all, the process of Sword Immortal Tian Hong's death was a little too ridiculous. No matter how one looked at it, it didn't seem like a way for an immortal sword-tier swordsman to die. Looks like I have to look for Ku Rakin. Gohan thought to himself. Ku Rakin had already left Shanhaiguan a year and a half ago. Given his entanglement with Sword Immortal Tian Hong, he would definitely find out the truth about Sword Immortal Tian Hong. Therefore, he would definitely be able to find out something from Ku Rakin. And Gohan's ultimate goal was to find the stolen sword maidens, find a four-winged angel sword, and help his disciple regain his dazzling life. All right, let's not talk about the past. Let's go back to the original question. Why is the sword tower's door locked? Where is Lu Shihua now? Chapter 1088. I really don't know. In the end, Teacher Li Xian had said so much, but he was unable to provide an answer to the first question. Yesterday morning, the entrance to the sword tower was locked. Pavilion Master Lu Shihua was nowhere to be seen. Besides, I'm not a member of the sword tower, so how could I know what happened there? Forget it. Take care, Teacher Li Xian. Gu Xianyuan waved her hand and walked towards the gate of the sword tower. Although Li Xian really wanted to get closer to this beauty, he immediately gave up on the thought that she was Guhan's sister and fled the place quickly. Looking at the tightly locked gate of the sword tower, Gahan fell into deep thought. As the previous pavilion master, Gahan naturally knew the sword tower very well. Although the sword tower was a huge and majestic building, there were no windows in the entire sword tower except for the pavilion master's office on the top floor. The gate of the sword tower was locked by a door lock made of emperor alloy. Unless one had the authorization of the pavilion master, it was impossible to unlock the door lock. As a result, entering the sword tower became a problem. It wasn't that Gahan couldn't force his way in, or he could just break a hole in the sword tower's wall. This was a rather amusing aspect of the sword pavilion. The lock of the sword pavilion's door was the strongest thing in the sword pavilion. The rest of the sword pavilion was made of dimensional alloy. An expert could easily break through the walls of the sword pavilion. If this was the sword tower of Beijing City, Gahan wouldn't even think about it and would just break the wall. However, this was the sword tower of Yuzhong City, which was considered Gahan's territory. How could Gahan bear to destroy his own things? As a result, Gahan was stuck outside the sword tower's gate, unable to advance or retreat. Either Gahan forcefully broke the sword tower's wall, or Gahan couldn't even think about entering the sword tower. Just when Gahan was feeling extremely distressed, Itian suddenly said to Gahan, "Go to the northwest corner of the sword pavilion. There's a wall there with the word Tian written on it. find the sun of heaven and press down hard on it. Then you'll be able to enter the sword pavilion. You're saying there's another secret door in the sword pavilion? Hearing Etion's words, Gohan was very surprised, but he still followed Etion's instructions. Sure enough, in the northwest corner of the room, he found a small, beetle-sized heaven character. Pressing down on the character, the wall in front of Gohan opened up, revealing a secret door that led to the interior of Sword Pavilion. Why does the Sword Pavilion have such a secret door? Why don't I, the Sword Pavilion Master, know about it? Gohan was very surprised to enter the Sword Pavilion through this secret door. After becoming the Sword Pavilion Master, Gohan read all the confidential information that only the Sword Pavilion Master had access to. However, none of those confidential information mentioned this secret door. This was left behind by Etion when he was building the Sword Pavilion. I didn't expect that after so many years, this secret door is still here. Etion lightly explained. Only now did Gohan remember that Etion and Etion Jindy had experienced the process of Yuzhong City from nothing to what it was. It can be said that Etion had watched the entire Yuzhong City being built. It seems that Etion Jindy had also left behind many secrets in the Sword Pavilion. For the time being, Gohan didn't think about Etion Jindy's matter. Instead, he strolled alone in the huge Sword Pavilion. The entire Sword Pavilion was empty. Not even the beautiful waitresses were there. Only the lonely sword ladies were placed on their respective stands for Gohan to admire and admire. Gohan had been to the Sword Pavilion many times. However, he had never been in a situation where he was the only one in the Sword Pavilion. This gave him a completely different feeling. It was a pity the time did not allow Gohan to slowly enjoy the strange atmosphere. Gohan quickly walked up to the 4th floor of the Sword Pavilion. The 4th floor was where the spirit sword ladies were placed. It was also Gohan's goal this time. Gohan wanted to find a spirit sword lady to synchronize with him. When Gohan stepped on the 4th floor, a familiar impulse instantly filled Gohan's body. All the sword ladies on the 4th floor seemed to want Gohan to immediately pounce on them and synchronize with them. I didn't expect the sword affinity to be so strong after reaching the spirit sword rank. Am I really that popular? Feeling the familiar impulse of the sword affinity, Gohan couldn't help but say with some smugness, I don't know if everyone still remembers this sword affinity. Any sword lady who takes the initiative to have a sword affinity with the sword holder has a much higher chance of synchronizing with them than under normal circumstances. The stronger the affinity, the higher the success rate. And now, almost all the Spirit Sword Grade Sword Maidens on the 4th floor had a strong sword affinity with Gohan, which meant that Gohan could choose any Spirit Sword Grade Sword Maiden on the 4th floor to synchronize with him. The importance of a Spirit Sword Grade Sword Mother was self-evident. Gohan, of course, had to choose the most suitable Sword Mother for himself. Unfortunately, the Spirit Sword Lady that Gohan thought was most suitable for him was not in the Sword Pavilion in Yuzhong City, but in Moscow Base City. Originally, according to Gohan's plan, he would not become a Spirit Sword Bearer for the time being. Instead, he had to go to Moscow to synchronize with the Spirit Sword Lady. Unfortunately, now that Yuzhong City was facing a huge crisis, Gohan had to give up his perseverance and sacrifice a part of his future for Yuzhong City to find a Spirit Sword Lady that was most suitable for him in Yuzhong City. There were not many natural Spirit Sword Ladies in Yuzhong City, only about 10. After Gohan's selection, Gohan found that there were actually 2 Spirit Sword Ladies that were most suitable for him. One was called God Beating Sword, which was said to have been transformed from the divine weapon God Beating Whip. It had infinite power and was the highest-ranking sword lady among all the Spirit Sword Ladies in Yuzhong City. However, Gohan felt that this sword lady was actually not very suitable for him, because the characteristics of this God-beating sword were very strange. God-beating sword was a killing path sword lady, and its killing path characteristics were like this. God-beating sword. All damage to Taoist and Buddhist-related Yuan Ko increases by 1,000%. All damage to non-Taoist and Buddhist-related Yuan Ko decreases by 1,000%. This Spirit Sword Lady was obviously specially used to deal with the Heavenly Court and Mount Lingshan and other forces Yuan Ko. When dealing with these Yuan Ko, the god-beating sword's effect could be said to be very obvious. It could be said to be an invincible divine weapon against these Yuan Ko. Its effect was even not weaker than the immortal sword lady. However, the problem was that the heavenly court and Mount Lingshan's Yuan Ko were only a small part of all the Yuan Ko. So when the god-beating sword faced the majority of Yuan Ko, its attack power would be reduced by 1,000%. Then in Gohan's hands, what was the difference between this spirit sword lady and a famous sword lady? It could even be said that it was not as useful as a famous sword lady. At the very least, when facing the lightning dragon, the god-beating sword's effect was not as useful as Juzi's. Therefore, very quickly, Gohan gave up the idea of using the god-beating sword and turned to another spirit sword lady that was suitable for him, Demon Blade Muramasa. From this name, it could be seen that this was another Fusang lineage's sword lady, and it was also the most famous sword lady in the Fusang lineage other than the heavenly Cumulus sword. It was said that this spirit sword grade sword lady was known as the Demon Blade before the Great Apocalypse. That was because all the masters who wielded this demon blade had all died under its blade. It could be said to be a master-killing sword. After the apocalypse, the demon blade, Muramasa, reappeared, and its killing path characteristics once again proved that it was indeed a spirit sword lady that killed its master. Killing its master. Intercourse with the Muramasa's sword lady, allowing the Muramasa to absorb the sword bearer's blood and essence through its lower body, permanently strengthening the demon blade Muramasa's attack power by 10% to 1,500%. Depending on the sword bearer's blood consumed, the demon blade Muramasa's attack power will be strengthened differently. The power of this characteristic was vividly demonstrated by the word permanent. Among all the sword ladies, there was no other sword lady that could be strengthened permanently. Moreover, it was a sword lady that could permanently strengthen the attack power by 1,500%. As long as the sword bearer consumed their own blood and essence, they could increase their strength by up to 15 times. Sorry, an increase in attack power by 1,500% was not as simple as a simple increase in strength by 15 times. Such an increase in attack power could even allow a spirit sword bearer to reach the attack power of an immortal sword bearer. Such a terrifying increase would inevitably come at a heavy price. And this heavy price was that the consumed blood and essence could not be recovered through medical equipment or even through the body itself. The Muramasa's sword bearer would not be able to recover this blood in their lifetime. According to calculations, to achieve the highest permanent strengthening of 1,500%, the sword bearer would need to consume 70% of the total amount of blood in their body. This was equivalent to reducing the upper limit of HP in the game. But the problem was that in the game, as long as you had 1 drop of HP left, you would still be alive. But in reality, if you only had 30% HP left, you would already be dead. In history, there was such a fool who tried to strengthen to 1,500%, but the fool died of severe anemia on the day of the strengthening. Some spirit sword bearers directly announced that they were suffering from severe anemia after the strengthening was completed. The bodies of these sword bearers instantly became extremely weak. Often, these sword bearers would die young in 2 or 3 years. Therefore, the strength of the Muramasa was completely exchanged with the sword bearer's own life. At the same time, it was a pain in the ass that after giving their blood and essence to the Muramasa, this sword bearer would forever lose the ability to reproduce. If they did not give birth to their own children before synchronizing with the Muramasa, then this sword bearer would definitely die. In fact, even if the Muramasa did not absorb the sword bearer's blood, his own attack power was among the best among all the sword ladies of the spirit sword realm. Therefore, there was no need for these sword bearers of the spirit sword realm to sacrifice their own lives in exchange for greater power. After successfully synchronizing with the Muramasa, some very rational sword bearers also very confidently announced to outsiders that they would never use their own blood and life to strengthen the Muramasa's attack, nor would they roll in the sheets with the Muramasa. As a result, in the end, these sword-bearers all went back on their words and madly used their own blood and essence to permanently strengthen the Muramasa. Later, according to the memories of these sword-bearers, after they got the Muramasa, they simply could not resist the temptation of the Muramasa. In the end, they rolled in the sheets with the Muramasa and offered their own blood and essence. Chapter 1089. These two spiritual level sword mothers were the best among the spiritual level sword mothers in Yuzhong City. The other spiritual level sword mothers were all very mediocre. Gahan could only choose one from these two spiritual level sword mothers. If he chose a mortal sword, then Gahan would simply break through the realm. In the following battles, he would still have to rely on the famous level sword mothers. But in the future, if Gahan fought with Yuan Ko of the Heavenly Court and Mount Lingshan, Gahan would undoubtedly have a huge advantage. If Gahan chose Demon Blade Muramasa, then when Gahan became a spiritual level sword holder and rolled in bed with Muramasa, his strength would probably have an extremely terrifying increase. A 15 times increase in attack power was not a joke. Moreover, Gahan's body had been strengthened by the 6 Revolutions elixir and was far stronger than the body of an ordinary sword holder. Maybe he wouldn't have to bear the curse of Demon Blade Muramasa. Gahan actually didn't mind rolling in bed with Demon Blade Muramasa. It was no big deal to just visit a prostitute. But the problem was that if this curse came true for Gahan, then it would be a little troublesome. Gahan was determined to leave a descendant for the Gu family. Gahan seemed to have forgotten that he already had a descendant. Wasn't Gu Xuanwu Gahan's biological daughter? But for now, the biggest problem with choosing Demon Blade Muramasa was that Gahan wasn't Gahan now, but Gu Xinyuan Yuan. When the two women were together, they could only be lesbians. Gahan couldn't use his blood and essence to strengthen Demon Blade Muramasa at all. In this case, Demon Blade Muramasa's effect was not as good as some other sword mothers. Just as Gahan was in a dilemma over this, the Qingpin sword in the scabbard suddenly jumped out on its own without Gahan actively releasing it. This was because when Gahan was in Yuzhong City, this sword lady who liked to live in the infant pouch was known to many people in Yuzhong City. In fact, many people in Yuzhong City knew that Gahan's ancient sword lady was the Qingpin sword, the treasure sword lady was the heavenly sword, and the famous sword lady was the Juzi sword. Moreover, the appearance of these sword ladies was also known to the curious people of Yuzhong City. Therefore, in order to ensure that his identity as Gu Xinyuan would not be exposed because of his sword ladies, after he transformed into Gu Xinyuan, all of Gahan's sword ladies were forced to stay in their scabbards by Gahan. However, Qingpin disobeyed Gahan's order and jumped out of the scabbard. Gahan, you want to synchronize with your spirit sword lady, right? Qingpin bit her lips and said to Gahan with a rare expression full of hesitation and confusion. Gahan had never seen Qingpin, this simple-minded cute guy, show such an expression. Are you Qingping or Qingpin? Seeing Qingpin show such a rare expression, Gahan began to wonder if the one in front of him was the Qingping sword. I'm not her, Qingpin immediately said in a panic, and at the same time covered Gahan's mouth with her little hand. Don't mention her name, or I'm afraid she will wake up. I know. Gahan nodded. At this moment, Gahan believed that the one in front of him was still his precious sword lady, the cute Qingpin sword, and not that annoying Qingping sword. Gahan, listen to me. If you really want to defeat her, and the two of us can live happily ever after, you must coordinate with her at the same time. Qing Jian quickly said. Her? What are you talking about? Gahan was startled. Why was the poor acting so mysteriously today? She is very powerful, and the only sword lady that this deity is afraid of. I shouldn't have told you about her. She shouldn't have come out again. This will completely destroy this deity's plan. However, Qingpin can't bear for Gahan to die, and Qingpin doesn't want Gahan to die either. So, Gahan, you must synchronize with her. This way, you might be able to destroy this deity's plan, destroy the plan of the person behind this deity, and then the two of us can be together forever. The poor girl hugged Gu Xinyuan, and her face was stuck between Gu Xinyuan's twin peaks. coupled with the forever and ever together. Such a child was simply the most beautiful lily blockbuster of the century between a lowly and an older sister. Who is she? Hearing Qingpin say this, Gahan became even more curious. Gahan, do you remember where you found me? Qingpin said again. I found you. You mean the sword burial land? Gahan suddenly recalled the moment when he and Qingpin met for the first time. At that time, he was preparing to synchronize an ancient sword's strongest sword lady. In the end, he encountered Liuyan Ling, who came to Sword Pavilion to synchronize the Yi Xian sword, and entered Sword Pavilion's most mysterious sword burial land. It was in the sword burial land that Liuyan Ling obtained the Yi Xian sword, and Gahan obtained the Qingpin sword. At the same time, Gahan and Liuyan Ling formed an inexplicable fate, and he also met the person who treated Gahan the best in his life, Gahan's master, Lu Lei. Now that he thought about it, the sword burial land was the most important place that changed Gahan's fate. He didn't expect that Qingpin would mention this place again at this moment. Go to the sword burial land quickly. She's in the sword burial land. I can sense that she's recovered a little, but she hasn't fully recovered yet. Now is the best time to synchronize with her. If you miss this chance, Gahan, you might not be able to synchronize with her for the rest of your life. Qingpin's sword said anxiously. Got it. Gahan nodded and leaped down from the fourth floor. He ignored the sword ladies who kept throwing flirtatious glances at Gahan and walked to the deepest part of Sword Pavilion's first floor. He gently pressed a button on the wall, and the door to the sword burial land opened once again. Almost 4 years had passed, but there were still no obvious changes to the sword burial land. It was still a desolate desert. Countless sword maidens were stuck in the desert, and the entire space was filled with a sorrowful emotion. The dim light from the incandescent lamps made the feelings of love even more sorrowful. There's no sword affinity. Gahan sensed around the sword burial land and realized that there was no sword affinity, based on how much a spirit sword lady liked him. If there was a spirit sword lady in the sword burial land that had recovered, then Gahan would definitely be able to sense the sword affinity. Gahan, come with me. Qingpin suddenly ran towards the depths of the sword burial land. Gahan hurriedly chased after Qingpin. When the two of them reached the deepest part of the sword burial land, Qingpin suddenly stopped and stomped on the desert beneath his feet. Finally, he said to Gahan with certainty, Here, she's right here. Gahan, hurry up and dig her out. She's right here. This place. Gahan couldn't help but feel a little surprised as he looked around. The other parts of the sword burial land were densely packed with sword ladies. He would encounter a sword lady almost every 2 steps. However, there wasn't a single sword mistress in this place. It was as if there was something here that the broken swords were extremely afraid of. All the broken swords had collectively avoided this place, leaving an empty space about 20 meters in diameter in the sword burial grounds. This feeling was as if there was suddenly an empty space of tens of square kilometers in the center of Yanjing City, where every inch of land was extremely expensive. There was not a single house in this empty space. It was as if all the developers were afraid of this empty space and did not dare to build anything on it. Could it be the she that Qingpin mentioned? That's why these broken swords are so afraid of her. Even though they're already broken, they still deliberately avoid this place. A few terrifying thoughts popped up in Gahan's mind, but he quickly threw these thoughts aside and began to dig in this empty space. Gahan didn't know how long he had been digging for. He only knew that even with his meteor stage Yuan-Ko body, he couldn't help but feel a little tired, but he still couldn't find any trace of the she that Qingpin mentioned. Qingpin, could the she you mentioned not be here? We can't waste any more time in the Sword Pavilion. The dimensional protection system in the core area of Yuzhong City might be broken. Gahan said impatiently. No, she's here. I can feel it, but she's hiding from you. She doesn't want to be synchronized with you. Qingpin said to Gahan after closing his eyes to sense for a while. And Qingpin's words made Gahan's heart couldn't help but feel a chill. This sword lady obviously didn't have synchronization. She was clearly buried deep in the desert, but she could still move freely and avoid him. What kind of sword lady was this? but it feels a bit similar to the Xianyuan sword. She can also jump and talk without synchronization. But the Xianyuan sword is an Emperor Sword Lady. The Shi that Qingpin mentioned can't also be an Emperor Sword Lady. Otherwise, how can a Spirit Sword rank sword wielder synchronize with her? Just as Gahan was thinking about this, Qingpin suddenly said in a solemn and formal tone that didn't seem like a little lowly's. I'm Qingping. Don't hide. What's the use of hiding? Do you want to hide until the world is destroyed? Qingpin seemed to be talking to the Sword Lady, but the Sword Lady didn't respond. It was as if Qingpin was singing a one-man show. We were originally the best sisters. I didn't want that to happen. I know you don't believe me. In fact, I don't believe me either. I'm just a personality that the main body created. I was only born to die, and I shouldn't have interfered in the matters between you and the original body. But now I have someone I cherish, and I want to be with him forever until the end of this world. I beg you, come out and help me. When Gahan heard Qingpin's words, he couldn't help but feel sour. It turned out that this cute girl also liked him. Unfortunately, the other party still didn't answer. Come out. You've already missed it once. Do you want to miss it a second time? Can you really let go of the obsession in your heart? Believe me, as long as I'm here, as long as Gahan is here, we still have a glimmer of hope. You still have a glimmer of hope in the world. Those sages can forget about returning to this world. This is your only hope. Do you really want to let him miss it? Is there really hope? This time, it was no longer silence. Instead, it turned into a powerless and helpless sigh. There is. Qingpin nodded. There definitely is. Gahan is our hope. Fine. I'm just risking my life. I'm not afraid of breaking again. As the voice faded, the surrounding desert began to churn continuously. Finally, a slender and simple long sword slowly rose from the desert like a lotus flower. Chapter 1090. Slayer's Sword. Guhan couldn't help but blurt out when he saw the mysterious sword Maiden rising from the desert. It couldn't be helped. Slayer's Sword was one of the most famous sword mistresses in human history. In history, Slayer's Sword had only synchronized with its wielder once, and its wielder was Blood Cuckoo Jindi. It was said that Blood Cuckoo Jindi, who was a spiritual sword wielder, encountered Slayer's Sword in an extremely dangerous place that Blood Cuckoo Jindi was never willing to mention again. At that time, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit was being hunted by a powerful enemy, and its famed and spiritual sword wielder were broken one after another. After encountering Slayer's Sword, Blood Cuckoo Jindi, who had more than 1,000,000 quarks of sword elements, did not have the ability to synchronize with Slayer's Sword. Slayer's Sword did not acknowledge this wielder. Helpless, Blood Cuckoo Jindi could only temporarily use Slayer's Sword's blade to fight. In the end, when Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit was on the brink of death, Slayer's Sword somehow acknowledged Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit. In an instant, it completed the synchronizing process with Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit, and then went on a killing spree, bringing Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit out of that dangerous place. From then on, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit became Blood Cuckoo sword spirit, and Slayer's Sword became Blood Cuckoo's immortal sword wielder. With this Slayer's Sword, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit became the most powerful immortal sword wielder. At that time, none of the immortal sword wielder was a match for Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit. No immortal sword wielder could last more than 10 minutes under Blood Cuckoo sword spirit's Slayer's Sword. Thus, Blood Cuckoo's sword spirit ascended to the throne and became Blood Cuckoo Jindi. However, in the Battle of the Alps, the Blood Cuckoo Sword Emperor, who fought until the end, couldn't escape her fate. The powerful exterminating immortal sword was forcibly broken under the joint attack of 3 desolate-level Yuan bandits. The Blood Cuckoo Sword Emperor's blood spilled on the battlefield and almost died in the Alps. If not for her son, Joey Jindi, risking his life to save Blood Cuckoo Jindi, the humans would have lost 2 Jindi. Then, because of a sudden sword aura that surpassed the immortal sword wielder, the Battle of the Alps came to a dramatic end. Blood Cuckoo Jindi returned to Fleeting Time Mountain with the fragments of the Slayer's Sword. She rarely left Fleeting Time Mountain. When blood cuckoo Jindy ascended, the fragments of the Slayer's sword were nowhere to be found. It seemed like blood cuckoo Jindy had sent the celestial sword to the sword burial ground in hopes of using the mysterious power of the sword burial ground to repair the precious, immortal sword wielder. The Battle of the Alps was the most tragic battle in human history. It was also a battle that concerned the fate of humankind. Hence, every detail of the Battle of the Alps had been studied countless times. The crucial Slayer sword was naturally the focus of the research. There were countless pictures of the Slayer sword on the internet. Hence, it was not strange that Gahan could recognize the Slayer sword at a glance. On the contrary, it would be strange if Gahan could not recognize it. It was worth mentioning that Blood Cuckoo Jindy broke her ancient sword wielder when she was a treasured sword. When she was a famed sword, she broke her treasured sword wielder. When she was a spiritual sword, she broke her famed sword wielder and then spiritual sword wielder. In the end, when she was an emperor sword, she broke her immortal sword wielder. Hence, when Blood Cuckoo Jindy ascended, she only had an emperor sword wielder. Hence, Blood Cuckoo Jindy earned the nickname Sword Wielder Terminator for the first time in history. However, Gahan was curious. Blood Cuckoo Jindy was a sword wielder who belonged to Yin Jing City. Why didn't she place the Slayer sword in Yin Jing City's sword burial grounds? Instead, she placed it in Yuzhong City's sword burial grounds, which had nothing to do with her. That's not right. Looking at the execution immortal sword, Gu Han could not help but frown. What I want to synchronize with now is a spirit sword grade sword maiden. This execution immortal sword is an immortal grade sword maiden. How can I synchronize with it? Furthermore, my immortal sword wielder already has the sword of victory. I can't synchronize with a second immortal sword wielder. It's fine. My strength has only recovered by half. Now, I'm a spiritual sword wielder. You just need to hold me. You don't have to worry too much. The Slayer sword said calmly. A spiritual sword wielder could actually speak without synchronizing with it. This was really too strange. Furthermore, wasn't the level of a sword wielder unchanging? Even if an immortal sword wielder broke, it would still be an immortal sword wielder. How could its level continuously change with the recovery of some strength? This simply went against the common sense of the sword wielder. However, Gahan thought of many things that had happened to him, especially when he thought about how he was only a famed sword wielder but had 6 sword wielder. It seemed like he was even more against the common sense of the sword wielder than the Slayer sword. Since the Slayer sword said that it could synchronize with Gahan, then Gahan had nothing else to say. He just had to give it a try. Even if he could not synchronize successfully, there would not be any loss. Thus, Gahan quickly walked to the side of the Slayer's sword. He stretched out his right hand and held onto the hilt of the Slayer's sword. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 1 minute, 5 minutes. A long time passed. There was no change between Gahan and the Slayer's sword. According to common sense, the success of the synchronization between the sword wielder and the sword mistress depended on the first minute of contact. Some people started synchronizing the moment they made contact, while others needed to wait dozens of seconds before they could start synchronizing. However, these dozens of seconds were never longer than a minute. Now that Gahan had held the Slayer sword for a full 5 minutes, there was still no change between the two. This fact clearly showed that Gahan could not synchronize with the Slayer sword. Everything was just Xingpin's wishful thinking. Impossible. How can Gahan not synchronize with you? Xingpin muttered to himself in disbelief. Don't ask me. I've already tried my best to suppress my inner restraint toward her. The Slayer sword's calm tone was filled with confusion. Clearly, it could not understand why the synchronization did not succeed. Forget it. Since it didn't succeed, forget it. I'll go synchronize with Demon Blade Village. Gohan sighed. It seemed like he was not fated to have the Slayer sword. He released his right hand and prepared to insert the Slayer sword back into the desert. However, the moment Gahan released his hand, Gohan suddenly realized that something was wrong. His right hand seemed to have merged with the Slayer sword. Gahan could no longer control his right hand. How can this be? Gohan reached out his left hand and tried to help his right hand release the Slayer sword's hilt. However, The moment Gahan's left hand touched his right hand, he realized that his right hand had become extremely hard. It was no longer a body of flesh and blood, but a hard rock. "My right hand is petrified," Gahan said in disbelief. Petrification was not a rare thing for a sword wielder. After all, every time the sword wielder and his sword lady synchronized, the sword wielder's body would need to be petrified once. However, only his right hand had been petrified, but the rest of his body was still a normal person. This had never happened before. Gahan was indeed someone who often went against the common sense of the sword lady. "What's going on? Why has your body become so strange again?" The Xianyuan sword in Gahan's purple palace started to toss and turn. It seemed like this Emperor sword lady also realized that Gahan's body was in a strange state. This power of habit is so familiar. Could it be? "Gahan, are you synchronizing with some sword lady?" The Xianyuan sword suddenly asked in shock. "Zhu, Xian, sword," Gahan replied word by word. "F*CK, you old hen. How did you get involved with that woman?" The Xianyuan sword jumped in shock and immediately shouted, "Hurry up and release my body from the dimensional pocket. I want to see the Zhu Xian sword." Without saying anything, Gahan immediately released the Xianyuan sword from his dimensional pocket. This Emperor sword that had not synchronized yet immediately floated in the air and circled around the Zhu Xian sword in Gahan's hand a few times. Then it clicked its tongue in wonder and said, "Zhu Xian sword, I didn't expect it to be you." "Xianyuan sword? I also didn't expect you to be here." Although the two sword ladies were in shock, the shock of the Zhu Xian sword was obviously calmer than the Xianyuan sword. Its words were still in chaos. "What's going on with you? How did you fall to the point where you have to synchronize with a spirit sword level sword wielder? If that old master of yours knew about this, he would probably be angered to death by you." The Xianyuan sword said with a gloating tone, "Don't mention that person. I have nothing to do with him. The level of sword wielder that I synchronize with has nothing to do with him." The speed of the Zhu Xian sword's speech became slightly hurried. Obviously, the old master that the Xianyuan sword mentioned did not have nothing to do with her like what the Zhu Xian sword said. She didn't care about it at all. "But you, the Xianyuan sword, what do you look like now? Where do you still have the bearing of the treasure of the human clan?" The Zhu Xian sword said sarcastically, "Hee, no matter what you say, I am still the treasure of the human clan." The Xianyuan sword laughed and said, "The two of us come from the same source. You four sisters were only born tens of millions of years earlier than me, and you have occupied more than half of the inheritance of the original source, making me always lower than you. Fortunately, my luck is not bad, and I became the treasure of the human clan. With the luck of the human clan, I can even suppress you. Are you particularly envious and jealous of me? What's the use of talking about the past?" The Zhu Xian sword's flat tone hit a flame. "If you have the ability to defeat us four sisters, then what's the harm in us lowering our head to you? What a joke. I have nothing better to do than to fight you four sisters at the same time." The Xianyuan sword involuntarily said a soft word. It seemed that the four sisters of the Zhu Xian sword had already formed a huge shadow in the heart of the Xianyuan sword. "But the Zhu Xian sword, what's your situation now? Why are you stuck in the middle of synchronizing?" The Xianyuan sword said with some smugness. "I don't know either," the Zhu Xian sword said somewhat helplessly. "Hee, it doesn't matter if you don't know, as long as I know." The Xianyuan sword circled around the Zhu Xian sword several times, as if it was dancing excitedly. Beg me, and I'll tell you what to do." Chapter 1091. Tis, Zhu Xian stopped talking. How could she beg this smug Xianyuan sword? "Can I beg you?" Gu Xianyuan stretched out her left hand and flicked the hilt of Xianyuan sword. "My Miss Xianyuan sword, please do me a favor and tell me what to do now. Forget it. For your sake, I won't argue with this fellow." Xianyuan sword found a way out of this embarrassing situation, then continued, "Actually, the responsibility for this is not on Zhu Xian, but on you." "On me?" Guhan was a little confused. "Then why don't you tell me? Why is the responsibility on me? Isn't it because you have two sword ladies at every level?" Xianyuan sword circled around Gu Xianyuan, Also, when you were in the furnace of heaven and earth, it completely changed your physique, so your current body is completely different from other sword wielders. Other people can only have one sword lady at every level, but you have to have two sword ladies at every level. Therefore, you have to synchronize with two spiritual sword ladies at the same time, or else the synchronization process will be stuck halfway, unable to continue. It's actually because of this reason Gohan did not expect the crux of the problem to be here. Due to various reasons, Gohan had two different sword ladies at Ancient Sword, Treasured Sword, and Famed Sword levels. However, Gohan had always thought that it was a special case. When he reached Spiritual Sword level, he still had to follow the normal rules for sword wielders and could only have one spiritual sword lady. But now, the special case had become the norm. Now, Gohan had to synchronize two spiritual sword ladies at the same time. Didn't this mean that in the future, Immortal Sword and Emperor Sword levels, Gohan would have to synchronize two sword ladies at the same time? Thinking of this, Gohan started to feel excited. To be able to have two sword ladies at the same time, in addition to the yin-yang sword tactics, Gohan's strength could already surpass almost all of the Jindy in history. Probably only Kinzu could be compared to Gohan. Good. Very good. Gohan's left hand clenched into a fist. He didn't expect that being stuck in the middle of synchronization wasn't a bad thing, but a good thing. However, Gohan changed his mind and said, "That's not right. All of my sword maidens were synchronized with me, and there wasn't a situation where they were stuck halfway like this. Why did such a change occur this time? Good my ass. What's so good about it?" The Xianyuan sword snorted coldly. "Do you think any sword maiden can synchronize with you? I'm telling you, you're in big trouble. The reason why an ordinary sword wielder can only synchronize with one sword maiden is because an ordinary person's Zifu can only withstand one sword maiden of the same level. The second reason is that a sword maiden will never allow a second sword maiden of the same level to appear in their Zifu. If two sword maidens of the same level appear in their Zifu at the same time, then they will fight each other until their Zifu is completely destroyed." Hearing the Xianyuan sword's words, Gohan suddenly remembered the time when he synchronized with the Doyu sword. At that time, when the Doyu sword entered Gohan's Zifu, it immediately fought with the heavenly sword that had already occupied the Zifu. This was an instinctive battle between the sword maidens. Although the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword were both unwilling to fight each other, the sword marks on Gohan's Zifu couldn't stop at all. If it wasn't for the severed black threads remnant hidden in Gohan's Zifu that suddenly came into play and fused the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword's hilt in a straight line, the two sword marks would never be able to hurt each other. Only then would the chaos calm down. And for the first time, a situation where two sword maidens simultaneously appeared in Gohan's Zifu. Even now, the sword marks on the Doyu sword and the heavenly sword in Gohan's Zifu were still connected to each other in this manner. I don't know how your Doyu sword and heavenly sword get along with each other, but I'm very familiar with the other four sword ladies. Although the Qingpin sword is an ancient sword maiden on the surface, her true strength has been firmly sealed. She isn't an ancient sword maiden at all, so she doesn't care about the appearance of a second ancient sword maiden's sword mark in your Zifu. This is just like how a tiger doesn't care about an ant. That's why your Qingpin sword and the past water sword can get along peacefully. And your Juzi sword and Qi Dian sword situation is a bit special, because Qi Dian sword forged a new body for itself in the form of the Juzi sword, and because the two of them were smelted in the furnace of heaven and earth at the same time, they receive the nourishment of your flesh and blood at the same time. To a certain extent, Qi Dian sword is the Juzi sword's twin sister, and the two of them are your biological daughters. That's why the sword marks in your Zifu believe that the other is one with them, so they haven't fought. Otherwise, your Zifu would have long been in chaos. What the hell is this Xianyuan sword talking about? Saying that Juzi and I are twin sisters is one thing. Saying that I'm Gohan's biological daughter. Then aren't Gohan and I messed up? Qi Dian sword's face was completely red as she thought about it. Suddenly, a different kind of pleasure appeared in her body. Yes, this was a strong sense of betrayal. Qi Dian sword's reaction was very strong, but Gohan directly ignored the words biological daughter that Xian Yuan's sword said, using a piece of flesh and blood to say that she was his biological daughter. Then wouldn't humans who had eaten the flesh and blood of countless animals be the biological children of countless animals? This was simply funny, okay? This Xian Yuan sword was definitely deliberately saying this to disgust him. However, Xian Yuan sword's words also completely explained why Gohan could have 6 sword ladies as a famous sword wielder. Although it was hard to believe that these opportunities and coincidences happened to him at the same time, it was indeed formed under all kinds of opportunities and coincidences. The current situation is that your body must have 2 sword ladies at the same level. Otherwise, you won't be able to synchronize successfully, and you will always be in a state of semi-synchronized coordination. But once you really synchronize 2 sword ladies at the same time, then these 2 sword ladies will definitely fight in your Zifu. If 2 spirit sword ladies are fighting, I guarantee that in less than 5 seconds, your Zifu will be completely destroyed, and then in another 5 seconds, your whole body will die along with them. Even if the gods come, they won't be able to save you. Xian Yuan sword continued to say, so I have to find a way to let 2 sword ladies exist in harmony in my Zifu at the same time. Gohan summed up what Xian Yuan's sword had just said and finally came to a conclusion. That's right. Xian Yuan's sword nodded. You understand very quickly. That's the reason, but the problem also lies here. Before you find a way to let 2 spirit sword ladies live in harmony in your Zifu, you absolutely can't synchronize the 2nd spirit sword lady. And if you can't synchronize the 2nd spirit sword lady, then you can only maintain the current state of semi-synchronized coordination with Zhu Xian. You're saying that my hand has to remain petrified with Zhu Xian until I synchronize the 2nd spirit sword lady, right? Gohan concluded, that's not a big problem. It's just that one of my hands has to always hold Zhu Xian. That's all. It's not a big deal. I can only say that it's not a big deal at the moment. Xian Yuan's sword swayed like a pendulum. But don't forget, your current identity is not Gohan, but you, Gu Xian Yuan. And your identity as Gu Xian Yuan can't be maintained for a long time. When the energy of the 6 revolutions immortal pill in your body is completely absorbed by your body, you will once again change back into Gohan's identity. What will happen if I change back into Gohan? There will be big trouble that you can't imagine. Xian Yuan's sword said with some excitement. Gu Xuanyuan's right hand has already fused with Zhu Xian, petrified together. This is equivalent to Gu Xuanyuan's right hand being completely fixed on Zhu Xian. But if the rest of your body turns back into Gohan, then what about your right hand? On one hand, your right hand has to forcibly transform into Gohan's right hand. But on the other hand, Zhu Xian's power has to forcibly fix Gu Xuanyuan's right hand. With these 2 forces in conflict in your right hand, even if you use your but to think, you can guess that your right hand is definitely finished. At that time, you might even turn into a pile of stone dregs with just a touch. What's the big deal? I can use the medical pod to get my right hand back. Gohan said indifferently. Wrong, wrong, wrong. You're very wrong about this. Xian Yuan's sword rested on Gohan's neck. Your right hand is not finished under normal circumstances. It's scrapped under the state of synchronization. The power of synchronization involves the origin of your human. It's equivalent to damaging your right hand from the origin, where you can understand it as completely destroying the genes of your right hand. At that time, even if the medical pod's power is 10 times or 100 times stronger, it's still impossible to help you grow back your right hand. You can only be a disabled person for the rest of your life. Disabled person, disabled person. Gohan muttered in his heart twice, imagining himself becoming a disabled person, and then he decisively found that he could not accept himself becoming a disabled person without a right hand. Don't ever think that being a disabled person is the end. In fact, you can be considered to have successfully synchronized with Zhu Xian. So once you turn back into Gohan, and your right hand that's halfway synchronized is scrapped, your Zifu will receive an irreparable blow. Even if you can luckily save the current sword lady, it's most likely impossible to synchronize with a new sword lady from now on. In other words, Gohan's life has stopped at the position of a famed sword-level sword-bearer. You'll be a disabled, famed, sword-level sword-bearer for the rest of your life. Gohan's face turned cold when he heard this. If this really happened, it would undoubtedly be a fate worse than death for Gahan. Then what will happen to me? At the same time, Zhu Xian, who had been silent all this time, suddenly asked. You, Xin Yuan's sword smacked its lips. You can be considered to have successfully synchronized now, but once Gahan's right hand is broken, you'll fail. When the two states of success and failure are added to your body, you'll always be sealed between success and failure. At that time, even if your old master takes action, you won't be able to recover. So if Gahan's hand is gone, you can consider yourself dead. Chapter 1092. All right. Zhu Xian took a deep breath and then asked Gahan, what exactly is going on with Gahan and Gu Xinyuan? Are you called Gahan or Gu Xinyuan? All right. It seemed like this great god still didn't understand what was going on with Gahan and Gu Xinyuan. Then let me explain. Xian Yuan's sword immediately jumped out excitedly. The beauty in front of you is called Gu Xinyuan, but in a month she will become an ugly man called Gahan. Zhu Xian was silent for a long time, and finally said, Pervert, enough. Gahan was too lazy to argue with Zhu Xian, because this matter did sound quite perverted. He turned to Xian Yuan's sword and said, So before I turn back into Gahan, I must synchronize with the second spirit sword level sword lady. Otherwise, my future will be ruined, and the Zhu Xian sword lady will be sealed forever. Right? That's right. After saying so much nonsense, that's actually what I mean. Xian Yuan's sword said with a smile. Then, Comrade Gahan, how do you plan to solve this problem? I already have a little clue. Xian Yuan's sword originally thought that Gahan didn't have any clue, but unexpectedly, Gahan nodded and said that he already had a little clue. This was out of Xian Yuan's sword's expectations. Say it. What exactly do you have? When the execution sword heard Guhan's words, it immediately became slightly excited. Although it was already indifferent to many things, this didn't mean that it was willing to be sealed between success and failure forever. The key to synchronizing with the second spirit sword level sword lady is to find a way to let the sword mark of the Zhu Xian sword lady and the second spirit sword level sword lady coexist peacefully. Regarding this, I have already succeeded 3 times, but the successful experience of ancient sword level and famous sword level can't be replicated. So I can only refer to the successful experience of treasure sword level, which is the method of harmonizing between heavenly sword lady and Douyu sword. At this point, Guhan paused for a moment. The heaven-reliant sword and the Douyu sword fought fiercely in my body back then. It was all thanks to the help of the green silk sword that I managed to merge their sword scars together that I was able to resolve their fight. So I think as long as I use the story of heavenly sword lady and Douyu sword, find a green silk slash, and use the power of green silk slash to fuse the sword marks of the Zhu Xian sword lady and the other spirit sword level sword lady together, we can solve this problem. That sounds like a good idea, although I think it's a little unreliable, the Celestial Slayer sword said faintly, but it clearly approved of the idea. That's a good idea. We just need to find the sever black hair. The Xin Yuan sword also praised. Mother of Asterisk Her, what the hell is this? I thought that I would never need to use the black hair severing technique again in this life. Who would have thought that I would still have to look for it in the end? Guhan smiled bitterly in his heart as he muttered to himself. This was not the first time Gahan had to find the green, severed hair. 3 years ago, when he had just become a famed sword-class sword wielder, Gahan had also faced a situation where he had to find the green, severed hair. He had also learned of 2 hair cutters. One was in the Lunyan family, and the other was in the Moscow Bay City. However, the final outcome was out of Gahan's expectations. Gahan had used the heaven and earth furnace to perfectly solve the problem of the Yu King's Gojian sword. In the end, the Yu King's Gojian sword had evolved into the starting point sword. At the same time, he had protected Gahan's famed sword Maiden Juzi sword, which he had synchronized earlier. It could be said that it was a happy ending. There was no longer a need to cut off the black hair. However, Gahan had never expected that 3 years later, he would have to face the same situation 3 years ago. I didn't want to go to the Lunyan family so soon, but it looks like I'll have to bring it forward. Gahan sighed. Whether it was Lunyan Ling, who had completely cut off contact with him, or to take revenge for the Black Tortoise, Gahan had to go to the Lun Yin family again and completely defeat the powerful Lun Yin family. However, Gahan did not have the confidence to completely defeat the Lun Yin family. According to Gahan's original plan, he should have waited until Gahan became a deity-level sword wielder. However, for the sake of the green hair severing technique, Gahan had to go first. Just as Gahan made up his mind to go to Yinjing City to settle things with the Lun Yin family after dealing with the lightning dragon and obtain the green hair severing technique, Qing Bin suddenly shook his head and said pessimistically, I can't sever the green hair severing technique. Qing Bin, what do you mean by that? Why can't I sever the green hair severing technique? Gahan asked curiously. Back then, the green hair severing technique allowed the sword scars of I Chien and Douyu to fuse together because of her help. It was with her power that the green hair severing technique became the glue between I Chien and Douyu. However, she definitely won't help the Zhu Xian sword fuse now. Even if you die, Gahan, and her plan takes a few thousand years, she still won't help. Are you talking about your main body, the Qingping sword? Hearing Qingping's words, Gahan was shocked. Gahan had always thought that the fusion had happened naturally. He hadn't expected the Qingping sword to help. From a certain point of view, the Qingping sword had saved Gahan's life. If not for the Qingping sword, Gahan would have already died in the trial formation. I was wondering why the green hair severing technique could help the two sword scars fuse. Now I understand. So it's because of your main body. There's nothing strange about that. The Zhu Xian sword also came to a sudden realization. There's no need to think about the green hair severing technique anymore. Once the Qingping sword knows of my existence, she will definitely not help you no matter what. Even though Gahan had 1,000 complaints, he didn't say anything in the end. He hadn't expected the green hair severing technique to be rejected. However, if that was the case, Gahan really didn't know how to resolve the predicament before him. Don't sigh. Who said, there are always more solutions than problems? The Xian Yuan sword's hilt stood on Gu Xuanyuan's head. While knocking on Gu Xuanyuan's head, it encouraged Gu Xianyuan. There's no need to think about the green hair severing technique anymore. However, it's not that there's no other way to solve this problem. At least I, this old mother, have a way. What way? Gahan quickly asked. The key to the problem is that when two spirit sword ladies are in the same Zifu, the two sword scars will constantly fight. Then let's change our way of thinking. As long as we find two sword scars that will absolutely not fight, it'll be fine. The Xian Yuan sword proposed a new way of thinking. Sword scars that will absolutely not fight? Are there such sword scars among the spirit sword ladies? Not to mention spirit sword ladies, even sword ladies of all levels in the same Zifu will still fight. Qingping sword said puzzledly. Other sword ladies are like this, but the Zhu Xian sword is an exception. Zhu Xian sword. Don't tell me that you don't know which sword lady I'm talking about. The Xian Yuan sword's voice was like a demon's, tempting the Zhu Xian sword. You're talking about my sisters? The Zhu Xian sword stared blankly, and its voice immediately became low. No, we four sisters have made a vow that we will never belong to the same master again. Do you want the disaster from 1,000 years ago to repeat itself? Tis TSK. You're saying it as if the disaster from 1,000 years ago has already ended. The Xian Yuan sword said disdainfully, isn't that disaster still happening now? Isn't this world still living in the suffering of the abyss of suffering? Isn't the sin that we're carrying still not washed away? I say, Zhu Xian, don't get entangled in the past anymore. If you really want to bear the mistake you made back then you should stand up and lead your sisters to end this mistake together, instead of making some bullshit vow that the four of you will never belong to the same master again. If the four of you don't belong to the same master, then you're no different from trash that can't even beat me. The Xian Yuan sword instantly said a secret that made Guhan feel extremely shocked. From the words of the Xian Yuan sword just now, it wasn't difficult to determine that the disaster from 1,000 years ago that the Xian Yuan sword was talking about was the Great Destruction. It was precisely because of that great destruction that this world was living in the abyss of suffering. Could it be that the source of the great destruction 1,000 years ago was actually the Zhu Xian sword in front of him? And the sisters of the Zhu Xian sword? What kind of existence was the Zhu Xian sword and her sisters that they could actually cause the great destruction that almost caused the extinction of mankind? I've never thought of escaping from my mistake. Otherwise, I wouldn't have synchronized with that woman back then. Hearing the words of the Xian Yuan sword, the Zhu Xian sword was sluggish for a while before faintly saying, "Even if I'm willing to break the vow I made back then, what about the other three sisters? I know that this vow was made by the three of them together." Clearly, the attitude of the Zhu Xian sword had softened. The problem has to be solved one by one. The Xian Yuan sword floated in front of the Zhu Xian sword. You should know that back then, the Yellow Emperor also defeated Qi Yu first, and then conveniently eliminated his old comrade, the Yin Emperor. So let's first solve your problem, then think of a way to deal with your sisters. I don't think you have the ability to convince my sisters, but there's no harm in trying. The Zhu Xian sword slightly trembled, but my sisters aren't schemed and broken like me. They're still at the immortal sword rank. Even if they agree to synchronize with this person, they still don't meet the condition that they have to be at the spirit sword rank like me. That's right. Why didn't I think of this? The Xian Yuan sword's voice was like a deflated balloon. Then it powerlessly poked Gahan's head with the tip of the sword. "Sorry, looks like you can only be a famed sword rank sword wielder for the rest of your life." Zhu Xian sword lady. Among your sisters, is there a sword lady called Zhu Xian sword? However, Gahan wasn't discouraged, and instead asked back with a slightly red face. "Zhu Xian sword." The Zhu Xian sword's body trembled. "That's right. She's my sister. How's she doing now?" "I don't know either." Gu Xianyuan smiled bitterly. "But purely in terms of encounters, Zhu Xian sword lady seems to be a bit more unlucky than you." Chapter 1093. Actually, Immortal Extinguishing Sword Lady's story precedes yours, Immortal Slaying Sword Lady. That's why I thought you already knew about her story. Gohan paused, then said a very familiar name. "I wonder if Immortal Slaying Sword Lady has heard of the Scarlet Sword Fairy." The Scarlet Sword Fairy? That's a familiar name indeed. Immortal Slaying Sword nodded, then recalled. "I remember now. I once watched a TV series called Yin Jing Destroyed. I think the Scarlet Sword Fairy's name was mentioned in it. I only watched the last few episodes. In the end, the Scarlet Sword Fairy wielded a famed sword lady and fought countless Yuan-ko. In the end, she perished together with the King of Nightmares. Although the story was rather touching and shocking, the actress who played the Scarlet Sword Fairy's acting was terrible. I didn't want to watch it anymore after a few glances. I still remember that at that time, little fresh meats were popular. In the end, when the Battle of the Alps began, Shui Wan, who hated little fresh meats the most, used her special authority to send Yang Mi, Wu Yifan, and alike to the front lines to perform. In the end, they were hit by Vairocana's Buddha's palm. Not even their ashes were left. Immortal Slaying Sword calmly recounted an interesting history that even Gohan didn't know. Then, Immortal Slaying Sword Fairy. Do you know who the Scarlet Sword Fairy's Immortal Sword Lady is? Gohan hurriedly brought the topic back on track. "I don't know. I only watched the last few episodes, and the Scarlet Sword Fairy wasn't the main character of the TV series. The plot didn't mention her Immortal Sword Lady at all." At this point, Immortal Slaying Sword suddenly came to a realization. Its voice trembled as it asked, "Could it be that the Scarlet Sword Fairy's Immortal Sword Lady is the Immortal Slaying Sword?" It seems like Immortal Slaying Sword has already guessed it. Gohan nodded. "That's right. The Scarlet Sword Fairy's Immortal Sword Lady is the Immortal Slaying Sword Lady." Then what happened to the Immortal Slaying Sword? Immortal Slaying Sword asked excitedly. "Sigh. The Scarlet Sword Immortal was too rash. After becoming an Immortal Sword Tier sword wielder, she hurriedly went to find Yuan-ko for revenge. In the end, she just happened to run into 3 Eternity Yuan-ko's meeting. The Scarlet Sword Immortal, who had just become an Immortal Sword Tier sword wielder, was defeated by the 3 Eternity Yuan Kos. Then, she was captured alive. In the end, she was even forcibly brainwashed by the King of Nightmares and turned into a lunatic. Guhan sighed as he thought back to the things that he had experienced with Sword Immortal Scarlet in the game's dungeon, as well as the things that Sword Immortal Scarlet had experienced in real life, and he couldn't help but sigh with emotion. After that battle, the celestial extinguishing sword disappeared. However, he later learned from King Arthur Artoria, who betrayed the Valhalla, that the immortal De Mortis sword was broken in battle and treated as a spoil of war. It had been stored in a large stronghold of the Valhalla for hundreds of years. That stronghold is still in the hands of the Valhalla. If I'm not wrong, then the fragments of a celestial extinguishing sword should still be in that stronghold. As long as we attack that stronghold, we can rescue the Lady of the Celestial Extinguishing Sword. Guhan's words revealed a different kind of emotion. After all, his words also involved Artoria. Impossible. That's impossible. Unexpectedly, after hearing Guhan's words, the Celestial Slayer Sword actually said that it was impossible. What's impossible? Celestial Slayer Sword Empress. Can you explain it more clearly? Guhan was stunned. The Celestial Extinguishing Sword can't be broken by 3 Eternity Yuan Kos. The Celestial Slayer Sword said with certainty. If this Scarlet Sword Immortal is really in sync with the Celestial Extinguishing Sword, then forget 3 Eternity Yuan Kos. Even 30, 300, 3,000 Eternity Yuan Kos can't break the Celestial Extinguishing Sword. Isn't that a bit too exaggerated? The Celestial Slayer Sword's words astonished Guhan. Even if Guhan reached the level of an immortal sword wielder, facing 3,000 Eternity Yuan Kos would only result in death. How could the Celestial Extinguishing Sword say that it couldn't be broken by so many Eternity Yuan Kos? To put it bluntly, didn't the Celestial Slayer Sword also break in the end? Guhan, you brat, don't doubt me. 3,000 Eternity Yuan Kos really can't do anything to them. Perhaps 3,000 Flood Yuan Kos are more likely. The Xin Yuan Sword added with a chuckle. The Xin Yuan Sword chuckled and added. Since the Xin Yuan Sword said so, it seemed that it should be the truth. But what was the background of the 4 Celestial Slayer Sword sisters? How could their power be so terrifying? And why would the Celestial Slayer Sword, one of the 4 terrifying Celestial Slayer Swords, break in the Battle of the Alps Mountains? It must be pointed out that none of the other immortal sword maidens had been broken. Back then, if Vairocana hadn't taken out Taoist Jieyins, the Celestial Slayer Sword was immersed in its own memories and unconsciously spoke a little more. But halfway through, the Celestial Slayer Sword immediately realized that it had let the cat out of the bag. It immediately said, "Anyway, the Celestial Slayer Sword can't be broken by 3 Eternity Yuan Kos. Where did you get this information from? Is it really reliable?" Well, of course, Guhan's information came from all sorts of information on the internet in his previous life. But after Guhan became the Sword Tower Master, he had also browsed through the official information on Scarlet Jindy. The story of what had happened to Scarlet Sword Immortal at the Martyr's Palace came from her own narration when she had temporarily regained consciousness. As for what exactly had happened, the Sword Commission had no reliable evidence. The only thing they could be sure of was that Scarlet Sword Immortal's immortal sword maiden was indeed the Celestial Slayer Sword. And the Celestial Slayer Sword had disappeared without a trace after Scarlet Sword Immortal returned to Yinjing City. As for Artoria's claim that she had seen the broken Celestial Slayer Sword in the Martyr's Palace, that was only Artoria's account. There was no evidence to prove that Artoria's words were true. Forget it. I think that Scarlet Sword Immortal must have encountered a trap specially prepared for us sisters, just like what I did. Scarlet Sword Immortal sighed and suddenly thought of something. She immediately asked Guhan, "Then what about the Celestial Captive Sword and the Celestial Slayer Sword? Have you heard of these 2 sword maidens?" "I've never heard of them." Guhan recalled the memories in his mind and then told the Celestial Slayer Sword with certainty. "At the very least, I've never heard of the Celestial Captive Sword and the Celestial Slayer Sword. I don't think they've been born yet." "That's good. They probably haven't fallen into those people's trap yet." The Celestial Slayer's sword let out a sigh of relief. Since it's come to this, there's nothing more to say. We'll immediately head to the Martyr's Palace base you mentioned and see if the Celestial Slayer sword is there. If she's still here, even if I have to risk my life, I must rescue her. Of course. Gahan nodded. I'll definitely find the Celestial Slayer sword and save her within a month. This isn't for her, but for myself. I won't allow myself to stay at the level of a famed sword for the rest of my life. Then what else is there to say? Let's go now, the Celestial Slayer sword said urgently. Not now. Gahan frowned. Yuzhong City is in danger. I must first drive away that flood-grade Yuan Ko before I can go to the Martyr's Palace base. Otherwise, the lives of tens of millions of people in Yuzhong City will be in grave danger. You want to save someone? The Celestial Slayer's sword suddenly sneered. How can you save someone in your current state? Why can't I save someone in my current state? Gohan retorted. Have you forgotten? You're still in a synchronized state with me. During this time, you can't use any other sword maidens apart from me, nor can you release any other sword maidens. You can't even inject sword essence. You can only use me as a sword maiden. The Celestial Slayer's sword said helplessly. So what? Gohan retorted. Don't you understand? The Celestial Slayer's sword was a little exasperated. I can't release myself right now. I can only hold it in your hand in sword form. Isn't letting you charge to a flood-grade Yuan Ko by yourself the same as sending you to your death? In terms of swordsmanship alone, you can't even defeat an ancient sword maiden. Even if I give you the supreme Pangu sword, you'll only be sending yourself to your death. So that's what you're worried about. Gahan couldn't help but laugh. Celestial Slayer sword, please don't worry about this. It's just a silly dragon. It's no big deal. Bullshit. Hearing Gahan's words, the Celestial Slayer sword couldn't help but shake a little to show its disdain for Gahan. Here, I have to say something for our beautiful Gu Xianyuan. Xianyuan sword chuckled and joked. In terms of swordsmanship alone, Gohan's swordsmanship might have already surpassed your old master's. Speaking of which, your old master's swordsmanship is really terrible. In his hands, you four sisters were only used to smash people. If he liked to smash people, he could have just used 4 huge hammers. Why did he use 4 swords? The Celestial Slayer's sword stopped talking. It really didn't know how to complain about its old master's swordsmanship, nor did it know if it should. Gohan tried to inject his sword essence into the Celestial Slayer sword through his petrified right hand. Originally, Gohan was worried that his petrified right hand wouldn't be able to inject sword essence, which would be a huge problem. However, it seemed like the result was still good. The sword essence could still be injected into the Celestial Slayer sword through his petrified right hand. Gohan casually swung his hand, and a stream of sword aura shot out from the Celestial Slayer sword's blade. Then, the sword aura directly hit the stone walls around the sword burial grounds. The entire stone wall let out a loud noise, and an area the size of 3 rooms and 2 halls suddenly appeared in the sword burial grounds, as well as a ground that had been burnt black. Oh my God! Looking at the charred black soil, Gohan was so shocked that his jaw almost dropped. Gohan swore to the heavens that he had only injected 100 quarks of sword essence. Even if Gohan released this kind of sword essence with his most powerful Chi-Yin sword, it would at most cause a deep wound on the wall. How could it be like this, where a mere 100 quarks of sword essence was able to dig out a space of 3 rooms and 2 halls? Speaking of which, how are your basic attributes, Celestial Slayer sword? Gohan suddenly realized that he still didn't know the various attributes and skills of the Celestial Slayer sword. Chapter 1094. Although the Immortal Eradication Sword had been synchronized once, Blood Cuckoo Jindi had never announced the Immortal Eradication Sword's attributes. There is also no information about the Immortal Eradication Sword in the official database. Therefore, if Gohan wanted to see the Immortal Eradication Sword's basic attributes, he had to scan it again. The easiest way to find out the attributes of a brand new Sword Maiden was to bring the Sword Maiden into Sword Maiden Online. The game would scan the Sword Maiden's soul and obtain the Sword Maiden's data. However, this data wasn't accurate. Players had to constantly battle in the game and constantly collect data to slowly adjust. The second method was to use professional equipment to scan the Sword Maiden. This way, the data obtained from the Sword Maiden would be more accurate than a simple in-game scan. That being said, it was complicated to build such professional equipment, and the materials needed were rare. Only the Sword Pavilion would be equipped with such equipment in every base city. After Gahan left the Sword Tomb with the Executioner Sword, he immediately brought the Executioner Sword to the scanner. Because this device was created more than 300 years ago, and there was no such thing as high-level intelligence in that era, the activation method was not through personal terminals, but through the DNA of authorized users in the Sword Pavilion. As the former Pavilion Master of the Sword Pavilion, even though Gahan had stepped down, he still had the authority to activate the device. Therefore, he quickly used the device to scan the Immortal Demise Sword. Normally, it would take around 10 minutes to scan a Sword Maiden, but Zhu Xian's sword scan took a full 30 minutes. Just when Gahan felt that this extremely precious machine might be damaged due to overheating and was about to forcefully shut it down to stop the scan, the machine finally gave the scan result. Immortal Slaying Sword. Material: undetectable. Origin: innate, unknown, unique, realm. Grade: 9th grade Sword Dao, Killing Dao. Path of Massacre Characteristic 1. Slaying Immortal Sword possesses the ability to continuously improve itself. Limit unknown. Killing Path Special Trait 2. Deals 150% to 1000% damage to all creatures higher than Dragon Class. Deals 15% to 90% damage to creatures lower than Dragon Class. Depends on the enemy's realm and attributes. Awakened. Form: Sword Form. The Sword Wielder. Deep Sword Mark: not deep. Damage Ratio: Sword Maiden Form. Sword Form 20. Guardian: Sword Maiden Form. Sword Form 0. Agility: Sword Maiden Form. Sword Form 6. Shield Reset Time: none. Durability: 100% synchronization coordination sword element requirement. 10000 synchronization time requirement. Initial sword mark engraving. After the initial sword mark is engraved, the wielder's sword element points will be increased by 100,000 points. Sword Scar Contract 1. A sword scar of the same origin appears in the Purple Palace, doubling the effect of the Killing Dao. Sword Scar Contract 2. Basic skills: passive skill, advanced skill, ultimate skill, Sword Scar Restraint. Born Noble. Belongs to the same wielder as the Xianyuan sword. In battle, 50% of the Xianyuan sword's attributes will be added to the Celestial Slaying Sword. Looking at the scan results, Gahan didn't know what to say. No wonder the scan lasted for 30 minutes. It turned out that there were many things that didn't have the final scan results and could only be replaced with a simple greeting. First of all, the Sword Maiden's realm was a question mark. However, Gahan could understand this because the Celestial Slaying Sword was originally a Sword Maiden at the Celestial Sword level. Now that it had fallen to the Spirit Sword level, its foundation was still at the Celestial Sword level. Therefore, the machine that didn't understand it could only give a question mark. The Killing Dao's characteristic was unexpectedly the same as the Starting Point Sword. They both had two characteristics. One of the characteristics was similar to the Starting Point Sword's characteristic. They both had the extremely rare ability to increase one's own level. However, the Starting Point Sword clearly stated that it could be upgraded to the Emperor Sword level, but the limit of the Celestial Slaying Sword was unknown. Perhaps the Celestial Slaying Sword could be upgraded back to its original Celestial Sword level, or it could be upgraded to the Emperor Sword level like the Starting Point Sword. In the end, it might surpass the limit of the Emperor's Sword and become the legendary Sword Maiden that surpassed the Emperor's Sword. The second characteristic of the Celestial Slaying Sword was the rare increase in damage to high-level Yuan Ko. In Guhan's mind, there were more than 1,000 Sword Maidens data. There were also dozens of skills that increased damage based on the enemy's realm. However, Gahan could guarantee that all the characteristics in these dozens of Sword Maidens would increase damage to Yuan Ko, who was lower than a certain level, and decreased damage to Yuan Ko, who was higher than a certain level. In other words, the lower the enemy's level, the higher the damage. However, there had never been a sword maiden with the same attributes as the celestial slaying sword. The higher the enemy's level, the higher the damage, but the lower the enemy's level, the lower the damage. Of these two types of sword maidens, the former was specially used to bully children, while the latter was specially used to challenge the strong. The stronger one's opponent was, the more power the celestial slaying sword could unleash. To Gahan, this was simply a top-grade sword maiden bestowed by the heavens. Then, there was the comparison of the basic attributes of the three sword maidens. Perhaps because they were not completely synchronized, the basic attributes of the celestial slaying sword maiden form could not be detected. That was understandable. However, what was up with the basic attributes of the sword form? The sword form's attack ratio was actually 20. One must know that Qi Dian's sword, as the strongest sword grade sword maiden, had an attack ratio of only 3.85. The celestial slaying sword attack ratio was actually 7 times that of Qi Dian's sword. It was no wonder that the sword Qi could directly destroy 3 rooms and 2 halls. The celestial slaying sword attack ratio was simply not on the same level as Qi Dian's sword. According to what Gahan knew, the strongest attack ratio among all the spiritual sword grade sword maidens was 4.01, while the strongest attack ratio of celestial sword grade sword maidens was 18.26. In other words, the celestial slaying sword attack ratio of 20 not only surpassed all the spiritual sword grade sword maidens, but it had also surpassed all the celestial sword grade sword maidens and entered the level of Emperor sword grade sword maidens. Although the lowest Emperor sword grade sword maidens had an attack ratio of 29, the celestial slaying sword's attack ratio was only at the bottom among the Emperor sword grade sword maidens, but it had still entered the category of Emperor sword grade sword maidens. If the celestial slaying sword attack ratio had reached the level of Emperor sword grade, then the celestial slaying sword defense ratio was also a level lower. The celestial slaying sword's defense ratio was actually 0. Combined with the personal shield reset time, none below, Gahan could basically confirm one fact, and that was that the celestial slaying sword did not have a personal shield. Gahan did not know whether it had a sword maiden form or not, but in sword form, it definitely did not have a personal shield. The wielder of the celestial slaying sword would use their own bodies to fight. In this way, no matter how shocking the celestial slaying sword's attack ratio was, the wielder did not have any defensive abilities. Once the invisible Yuan Ko got close to them, the wielder would probably be killed instantly. For a spiritual sword grade sword maiden like this, even if the attack ratio was increased to 100, no wielder would dare to use her. This was because every time the wielder used it, they would be using their own lives as a joke. A sword maiden that could not provide the wielder with a personal shield was unheard of among all the sword maidens. Even when Blood Cuckoo Jindi used the celestial slaying sword back then, he had never heard of Blood Cuckoo Jindi not having a personal shield. Could it be that this was the after effect of breaking it? Or when the celestial slaying sword returned to the immortal sword grade, this personal shield could reappear? Well, let's put this question aside for the time being. Other sword wielders did not dare to use it, but for Gu Xinyuan at this time, it was not a fatal weakness. Although the loss of the personal shield did greatly increase the danger factor for Gahan, Gahan was confident that with his own swordsmanship, the opponent would not even be able to touch a hair on him. Even if he could touch a hair on Gu Xuanyuan's body, Gu Xuanyuan's body was gradually evolving towards the meteor stage Yuan Ko's physical quality. As long as he had the physical quality of the meteor stage Yuan Ko, then Gahan would be equivalent to having a spiritual sword grade sword maiden's personal shield. His safety factor would be greatly increased, and the need for the personal shield would not be so urgent. Not to mention the next series of sword maiden skills and sword mark contract, it was worth mentioning that the celestial slaying sword actually had 2 sword mark contracts. The sword maiden described in sword mark contract, one should refer to the extinguish immortal sword, trap immortal sword, and kill immortal sword. Every time he synchronized one of them, the effect of the kill immortal sword's terrifying killing path characteristic could be doubled. If all 4 sword maidens were in Gahan's hands at the same time, then wouldn't the killing path characteristic 2 become 450 to 3,000% restrain damage to all creatures higher than the dragon level, and 5 to 30% restrain damage to creatures lower than the dragon level, depending on the enemy's realm and attributes. This was simply to the point where he could kill anything that stood in his way. As for the Swordmark Contract 2, that was full of question marks, Gahan expressed great anticipation. Gahan had a feeling that this might be more terrifying than the Swordmark Contract one. Finally, the only one that was shown was called Born Noble Swordmark Fetters. Obviously, this fetters meant that the Kill Immortal Sword was born noble than the Xianyuan Sword, so 50% of the attributes of the Xianyuan Sword were added to the Kill Immortal Sword. He believed that once the Xianyuan Sword saw this Swordmark Fetters, it would jump up in anger and fight the Kill Immortal Sword. To put it bluntly, but in terms of the attributes that were currently scanned, the Kill Immortal Sword had already stepped on the bodies of all the Sword Maidens of the Spirit Sword Realm and became the number 1 Sword Maiden of the Spirit Sword Realm, smoothly continuing Gahan's fine tradition of being the number 1 Sword Maiden of the same level. Just as Gahan was immersed in the attributes of the Kill Immortal Sword, Gu Xuanyuan's body, which had been strengthened by the 6 Revolutions elixir, immediately heard a burst of voices suddenly coming from the entrance of the Sword Pavilion. It seemed that there were a lot of people at the entrance of the Sword Pavilion. Gahan quickly entered the control room next to the instrument and found that the monitoring system of the Sword Pavilion had not been turned off yet. So Gahan immediately pulled up the monitoring of the gate of the Sword Pavilion and found that there were a lot of people standing at the gate of the Sword Pavilion, and Gahan recognized the 2 leading them. One of them Gahan had seen with his own eyes and had fought with him many times. This person was naturally the old guy, Serene. As for the other sword holder, although Gahan had not seen him with his own eyes, he had read all kinds of information about him long ago. He knew that this person was Sword Immortal Ling Su, the sword holder of the Immortal Sword Realm in Los Angeles, and also the current chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Committee. Why did these 2 people suddenly appear at the gate of the Sword Pavilion? Elder Shur, what should we do if the gate of the Sword Pavilion can't be opened? Sword Immortal Ling Su, the new chairman of the Yuzhong Sword Committee, asked unhappily. Chapter 1095. This door lock is not easy to open. Elder Shur looked at the tightly locked door and said, I know this lock. It's made of Emperor alloy. Once this lock is closed, unless the Sword Pavilion Master comes personally, this door will never be opened. Only Lu Shihua can open the door. Sword Immortal Ling Su's brows furrowed. Why didn't you say anything when you sent her away 2 days ago? Now that we can't open the door to the Sword Pavilion, isn't this a big problem? Do we have to invite Lu Shihua back? What? Lu Shihua was sent away by them? Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su's words, Gahan finally understood why Lu Shihua was nowhere to be seen. So Lu Shihua was sent away by these people. But why was Lu Shihua sent away by them? And where did they send Lu Shihua? Was Lu Shihua's life in danger? Thinking of this, Gahan was extremely anxious. He wanted nothing more than to jump out and ask these questions. However, Gahan resisted this urge and continued to hide in front of the surveillance camera. He wanted to see what else these 2 people were talking about, because if Gahan forced them, these people definitely wouldn't tell Gahan the real answer. At the very least, they would hide some things. Only as a bystander, when their guard was at its lowest, would he be able to hear the real answer. We lost contact with Mu Shui and the others yesterday. They should have entered the forest in Sichuan by now. The quantum communication signal in that area isn't very good. We can only wait until they leave Gansu and reach the Middle East. Then we can use the Jerusalem base to restore communication. This will take at least 3 days. Within 3 days, we probably won't be able to contact Mu Shui and the Sword Spirit, let alone bring Lu Shihua back. Shijun gritted his teeth. Then what do we do? Hearing Shi Juyuan's words, Sword Immortal Ling Su was instantly enraged. Not only is there a flood-level giant dragon that popped out of nowhere, but according to the news from Fort Yuyang, the Heavenly Court, the Palace of Martyrs, and the League of Legends under Yuan Ko are all very active. They are gathering around Yuzhong City. When these 100,000 Yuan Ko have gathered, Yuzhong City will be destroyed. It's exactly as I speculated. Once the superdimensional defense system at the periphery of Yuzhong City is breached, the forces of the Yuan bandits are all on the move. They are ready to organize a coalition army to destroy Yuzhong City. Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su's description of the situation in Yuzhong City, Gahan couldn't help but clench his fists. I know, Chairman of the Sword Council, I know the situation facing Yuzhong City better than you do. Just the giant dragon's attack is enough to overwhelm the core's dimensional barrier system. In 2 days at most, the core's dimensional barrier system will be destroyed. When that time comes, we will have to face a sea of Yuan Ko and flood-level Yuan Ko. The destruction of Yuzhong City is a foregone conclusion. Therefore, our top priority is to evacuate all the Sword Emperor family members, the sword bearers and their families, and the sword ladies in the sword pavilion, Shi Jiyuan said. These guys. Hearing Shi Jiyuan's words, Gohan felt a surge of anger in his heart. The core's dimensional barrier system could still hold out, and Yuzhong City still had a chance to continue fighting. However, Shi Jiyuan was already planning to escape. He even shamelessly placed the Sword Emperor family members in front of everyone. Clearly, he planned to let the Sword Emperor family be the first to escape. After all, the first to escape had the highest chance of success. Moreover, Shi Jiyuan had never mentioned the word ordinary people. Clearly, in Shi Jiyuan's mind, he had already given up on the 40 million ordinary people in Yuzhong City. He only planned to escape with the sword bearers and their families. What about the ordinary people? Compared to Shi Jiyuan, Sword Immortal Ling Su still maintained the most basic conscience of a sword bearer. He considered the lives of the 40 million ordinary people in Yuzhong City. That can't be helped. We've already tried our best. Shi Jiyuan spread his hands. The sword bearers are the most important capital of Yuzhong City. The ordinary people don't matter. If they die, they die. When Yuzhong City is rebuilt, we can migrate a group of people from Yinjing City. I remember that Yinjing City's 7th Ring Road is almost full. If we help them relieve some of the population, it will be in line with Yinjing City's wishes. It's not a big deal. You vicious guy, you actually plan to give up the lives of 40 million people. Even Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't help but be shocked when he heard Shi Jiyuan's words. Even if I don't give up, they will still die here. Shi Jiyuan probably felt that saying such words was very shameless, so he tried to explain himself. We're running for our lives. It's not like Yuzhong City hasn't been attacked before. At that time, it was because those sword bearers were too pedantic and insisted on bringing the ordinary people with them to escape. As a result, they were constantly attacked by Yuan Ko along the way. In the end, when they escaped to Yinjing City, only 1/10 of them were left. If all the sword bearers escape together and don't have to worry about protecting the ordinary people, I believe that at least 2/3 of the sword bearers can be saved. Sword Immortal Ling Su, you're the savior of all the sword bearers. As long as the sword bearers can survive, your base will not be affected, and Yuzhong City can be rebuilt more quickly. Moreover, those ordinary people might be safer in the underground shelter. There's enough food there for them to use for 3 years. As long as we retake the city after 3 years, there might be far more than 1/10 of the ordinary people left alive. This, Sword Immortal Ling Su pondered for a while. Forget it. You're from Yuzhong City, and you don't care. I'm from Los Angeles. Why should I care? You can arrange for the retreat. Gohan didn't think that he would witness such a shameless scene. The 40 million people of Yuzhong City had been thrown underground by these two guys with a few words. These guys made it sound good, saying that they could retake the city after 3 years. But they didn't look at history. Which time in history didn't Yuzhong City rest in Yinjing City for more than 10 years? And only after they produced an Emperor Sword level sword bearer did they have the ability to retake Yuzhong City. Based on the current situation, with just these idiots and without Gahan, Yuzhong City wouldn't be able to be rebuilt even after another 30 years. By then, the ordinary people underground would all starve to death in the underground shelter. And in history, every time Yuzhong City retreated, it was all humans who fought together until the end. Then, the ordinary people and the sword bearers would support each other all the way to Yin Jing City to recuperate. Of course, Gahan knew what kind of pain and suffering one had to go through to escape from Yuzhong City to Yin Jing City. The first time Yuzhong City was attacked, no less than 10 million people escaped. In the end, only 700,000 people reached Yin Jing City. The second time, 12 million people were reduced to 1 million. The third time, 14 million people were reduced to 900,000. Each time, more than 90% of the ordinary people died or were injured, and more than 70% of the sword-bearers died or were injured. This was a song of blood and tears in Yuzhong City. Gahan admitted that if he let the sword-bearers escape alone and didn't care about the lives of the ordinary people, the death rate of the sword-bearers would not exceed 30%. If they were lucky, more than 90% of the sword-bearers would be able to escape to Yin Jing City safely. From a certain perspective, this was indeed the right choice. This was because the sword-bearers were indeed more important than the ordinary people. But this way, the people of Yuzhong City would completely lose faith. Even if the population of Yin Jing City exploded, it was likely that no ordinary people would be willing to follow the sword-bearers who had given up the lives of the ordinary people to rebuild Yuzhong City. Even if the sword-bearers of Yuzhong City remembered that they had relied on the lives of 40 million people to survive, they would probably feel a deep sense of guilt in their hearts. They would completely lose their recognition of Yuzhong City. When the sword-bearers of Yuzhong City lost faith and the ordinary people were unwilling to return to Yuzhong City, there would be no possibility of rebuilding Yuzhong City. Not only would Yuzhong City disappear forever, but it would also become a symbol of shame in the history of Huaxia. People would use history to tell their descendants that the sword-bearers of Yuzhong City were a group of shameless people who gave up the lives of 40 million ordinary people to save their own lives. I can't be soft-hearted anymore. Guhan secretly made a decision in his heart. People like Shi Jueyuan can no longer stay in Yuzhong City. Otherwise, Yuzhong City's eternal reputation will be destroyed in one day. While Gahan was making up his mind, the conversation between Shi Jueyuan and Sword Immortal Ling Su is still going on. The most important thing for us right now is to take away the Sword Maidens from the Sword Pavilion. They are the true foundation of Yuzhong City. Without them, Yuzhong City will really lose all hope of rebuilding. We must open the gates of the Sword Pavilion. Sword Immortal Ling Su said firmly. Didn't I say that without Lu Shihua, this lock can't be opened at all? Shi Jueyuan said with a pained expression. If you can't open it, then smash it. If you can't smash it, then break the wall. A hint of viciousness flashed across Sword Immortal Ling Su's face. This lock is made from imperial alloy. Could it be that these walls are also made from imperial alloy? I can break the wall with one swing of my sword. When that happens, I can just go in and take away the Sword Maidens. What's the point of caring about this lock? You want to break the wall? How can you do that? This is a historical site and symbol of Yuzhong City that has existed for over 700 years. Even when Yuzhong City was conquered, the Sword Pavilion remained unscathed. How can you break the wall and enter? Unexpectedly, Shi Jueyuan was starting to understand the need to protect the cultural relics and the symbol of Yuzhong City. At a time like this, who cares about the cultural relics and historical sites? Please make way for me. Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't be bothered to say anything more to Shi Jueyuan. He walked directly to a wall beside the gates of the Sword Pavilion and slashed at it with a burst of sword intent. This wall that had been built 700 years ago naturally couldn't withstand the attack of the Sword Immortal. Dust flew into the air, and a huge hole appeared in the wall of the Sword Pavilion. I'll take care of all the Sword Maidens. I'll protect the safety of these Sword Maidens. Sword Immortal Ling Su rushed into the Sword Pavilion impatiently. He was determined to control all the Sword Maidens in his hands. These sword maidens could be said to be the most precious wealth of Yuzhong City. They were also the foundation of whether or not Yuzhong City could be rebuilt. If Yuzhong City could be rebuilt, then so be it. However, after hearing Shi Jiyuan's plan, Sword Immortal Ling Su came to a sudden realization. Yuzhong City would probably never be rebuilt again. If that was the case, then he had to control the sword maidens. When the rebuilding of Yuzhong City failed, these sword maidens could naturally enter the sword pavilion in Los Angeles. After all, Sword Immortal Ling Su was from Los Angeles. Chapter 1096. Where are the Sword Maidens? Where are the Sword Maidens? When Sword Immortal Ling Su rushed into the sword pavilion impatiently, wanting to store all the sword maidens into his dimensional pocket, he was stunned to find that the entire sword pavilion had been emptied. All the sword maidens in the sword pavilion had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only an empty display stand, which told everyone that a large number of sword maidens had once been stored here. Who was it? Who did this? Sword Immortal Ling Su yelled loudly at the empty sword pavilion. He had a feeling that the person who had emptied the sword pavilion was still in the sword pavilion at this moment. Keep your voice down. You're making it sound like this is your home. A light and ethereal female voice rang out in the sword pavilion. Sword Immortal Ling Su and the others hurriedly looked in the direction of the voice, only to see a devastatingly beautiful woman hovering in the air. Although this woman was wearing a jacket that only men would wear and a pair of men's jeans, even though this woman was dressed in men's clothing, it was still difficult to conceal her stunning beauty. Even the experienced and knowledgeable Sword Immortal Ling Su and the elderly Shi Jing couldn't help but feel their hearts flutter when they saw this woman, and the delusion of having sex with this woman welled up in their hearts. People of this age and experience had long become indifferent to things like love. What they needed was direct physical pleasure. However, this kind of erotic delusion only lasted for a short while before it was suppressed by these two scheming men. This woman was clearly the criminal who had plundered all the sword maidens in the sword pavilion. And this criminal actually dared to appear before an immortal sword tier sword wielder and a spirit sword wielder so brazenly. This woman definitely had her own trump cards, and they couldn't afford to be careless. May I know the name of this female comrade? Sword Immortal Ling Su desperately tried to recall his memories, but he still couldn't recall who this woman was. Since this woman could float in the air, she must be a spirit sword level or above. Although Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't recognize the appearances of all spirit sword rank and above sword bearers like Gahan, it was impossible for Sword Immortal Ling Su not to have any recollection of such a beautiful spirit sword rank sword bearer. However, Sword Immortal Ling Su really couldn't recognize this spirit sword rank sword bearer. He could only guess that this was a powerful spirit sword rank sword bearer who had just become a spirit sword rank sword bearer. Sword Immortal Ling Su's guess was correct. Gu Xianyuan had indeed only just become a spirit sword wielder today. My name is Gu Xianyuan, Gu Xianyuan said with an expressionless face. Gu Xian Fate. Sword Immortal Ling Su recalled this name again, and even looked up the information on all the spirit sword rank sword bearers in his personal terminal. He discovered that there wasn't even a person with the surname Gu, let alone Gu Xuanyuan's name. It seemed that this Gu Xianyuan was indeed a newbie who had just become a spirit sword rank sword bearer, and hadn't even had the time to register with the Sword Committee headquarters yet. Solid. Your surname is Gu. In contrast to Sword Immortal Ling Su's confusion, Shi Jiyuan seemed to have thought of something. He looked at Gu Xianyuan with a look of horror, as if Gu Xianyuan was his mortal enemy. Solid. Shi Jiyuan's words reminded Sword Immortal Ling Su of Gu Xianyuan and the former Yuzhong City Sword Pavilion Lord. At the same time, he recalled Guhan's appearance and compared it with the Gu Xianyuan before him. He discovered that the two were actually 50 to 60% similar. This Gu Xianyuan was like Gahan had become a woman. What is the relationship between this female comrade and our Yuzhong City's former Sword Pavilion Lord, Comrade Gahan? Sword Immortal Ling Su asked directly. He was an immortal sword rank sword bearer, so there was absolutely no need for him to have any misgivings about a spirit sword rank sword bearer. If he wanted to know anything, he could just ask. He reckoned that this Gu Xianyuan wouldn't dare to not answer him. Gohan is my younger brother, Gu Xianyuan admitted very straightforwardly. Sword Immortal Ling Su nodded to himself. This Gu Xianyuan could be considered honest. He guessed that this Gu Xianyuan was also Gohan's relative. If she wasn't an older sister, then she was a younger sister. There was no other possibility. Then did you take all the sword maidens here? Sword Immortal Ling Su's expression instantly became serious and ugly. He questioned Gu Xianyuan sternly. That's right. Gu Xianyuan nodded, still admitting very straightforwardly. Give me the sword maidens you took. A threatening expression appeared on Sword Immortal Ling Su's face. He extended his right hand towards Gu Xianyuan. You actually dared to steal the sword maidens of the sword pavilion. You'd better return all the sword maidens to me right now. Otherwise, don't forget the rules of Yuzhong City. Those who dare to steal sword maidens will be killed without mercy. Oof, what a joke. Do you two think you're qualified to talk about rules with me? Gu Xianyuan sneered fearlessly. My younger brother asked me to take care of them for him. My younger brother told me that there's nothing good in Yuzhong City right now, nor is there anything reliable. If the sword maidens of Yuzhong City fall into the hands of others, they might end up in some other city's sword pavilion. Thus, he asked me to take care of them for him. When he meets the sword pavilion lord, Lu Shihua, he'll personally return all the sword maidens to her. Gu Xuanyuan's words caused Sword Immortal Ling Su to feel very guilty. Just as Gu Xianyuan had said, this Sword Immortal Ling Su was indeed planning to turn the sword maidens of Yuzhong City into the sword maidens of Los Angeles City. His scheme had been exposed by this woman. This made Sword Immortal Ling Su feel even more infuriated at the same time as he felt guilty. Gohan is no longer the sword pavilion lord of Yuzhong City. Why does he have to order you to take care of the sword maidens of Yuzhong City? Sword Immortal Ling Su did his best to suppress the rage and guilt in his heart. He was still trying to negotiate his way back to the Sword Mother. Besides, your brother is currently a wanted criminal by the Sword Commission. He's a criminal who has committed the most heinous crimes. Not to mention the fact that he's no longer the Sword Pavilion Lord. Even if he was still the Sword Pavilion Lord, he's no longer qualified to take care of these precious sword maidens. Besides, Yuzhong City is in danger now. You're just a small spirit level sword wielder. You're nothing in front of a flood-level sword wielder like Yuan Ko. Only an immortal sword wielder can guarantee the safety of the sword maidens and bring them safely back to Yanjing City. Do you want to watch as Yuan Ko takes away all the sword maidens of Yuzhong City? Sword Immortal Ling Su tried very hard to persuade Gu Xianyuan. Unfortunately, it was of no use. Oof. Sword Immortal Ling Su, do you think I, Gu Xianyuan, don't know what you're planning? And that shameless Shurduan behind you, I want to talk about how he framed my brother back then. Now, I want to ask the two of you, what exactly did you do to my brother's disciple, Lu Shihua? Gu Xianyuan stared at Shurduan's head that was covered in white hair and asked, Lu Shihua. Sword Immortal Ling Su hesitated. She's too weak. We decided to send her to Yanjing City. Yanjing City is safer there. Send her to Yanjing City, right? Gu Xianyuan was amused by Sword Immortal Ling Su's words. All right, the entire journey from Yanjing City to Yuzhong City is within the range of the quantum communication network. You can contact Lu Shihua right now. As long as Lu Shihua tells me personally that she can entrust these sword maidens to you, I'll give them to you right now. This Sword Immortal Ling Su was starting to regret his decision to lie and say that Lu Shihua had been sent to Yanjing City. Now, Lu Shihua had entered an area where the quantum communication network couldn't cover. How is he going to contact Lu Shihua now? It looks like this woman must have already tried to contact Lu Shihua, but found that she couldn't. That's why she's forcing me like this. Thinking this, Sword Immortal Ling Su's eyes followed Gu Xuanyuan's arm. He was shocked to find that the personal terminal on Gu Xuanyuan's arm had been damaged. And only now did Sword Immortal Ling Su realize that Gu Xianyuan was holding a long sword in her hand. Just now, Sword Immortal Ling Su's attention was focused on Gu Xuanyuan's beauty, so he didn't notice the long sword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand. But at this moment, Sword Immortal Ling Su suddenly remembered that the long sword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand had never left her right hand. This was not a friendly signal. Who would keep holding a murder weapon while talking to their friends? Only now did Sword Immortal Ling Su realize that he couldn't rely on communication to reach a consensus with Gu Xianyuan. He had to first control this Gu Xianyuan. As long as he could obtain Gu Xuanyuan's dimensional pocket, then even if Gu Xianyuan wasn't willing to open it for him, he could just have the city of Los Angeles consume some Emperor blood and activate the sword washing pool to forcibly open her dimensional pocket. Understanding this, Sword Immortal Ling Su lightly patted the hilt of his sword. A girl in a blue dress, who was as cold as the stars in the sky, appeared behind Sword Immortal Ling Su. Gu Xianyuan recognized this girl. She was Sword Immortal Ling Su's sword maiden, Wang Shujian. Comrade Gu Xianyuan, let me give you one last piece of advice. If you hand over the sword maiden of Yuzhong City now, I promise you can leave here safely. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude. Although I, Sword Immortal Ling Su, don't like to attack women, when I do, I can be even more ruthless than men. Sword Immortal Ling Su threatened viciously. Nonsense. Sword Immortal Ling Su never would have thought that this spirit sword tier sword wielder would make the first move before he, an immortal sword tier sword wielder, had even made his move. A flash of light, like lightning, flashed past. Sword Immortal Ling Su's face was already covered in blood. However, this blood didn't belong to Sword Immortal Ling Su. Instead, it belonged to Shi Juan, who was standing behind Sword Immortal Ling Su. This old man, who hadn't even released his sword maiden, also never would have thought that Gu Xuanyuan's primary target would be him. What's more, when an immortal sword tier sword wielder was standing right in front of him, Gu Xianyuan actually had the guts to kill him. When Shi Juan saw the sky full of blood splatter, he subconsciously wanted to touch his own neck. In the end, apart from feeling a sticky, still steaming blood, he didn't feel anything else. Where did my head go? This was Shi Juan's last thought before he died. What a useless piece of trash. Gu Xianyuan wiped the blood off the slaying immortal sword. He's getting old, and he doesn't even have the most basic vigilance of a sword wielder. Doesn't he know that he has to show his sword scars and activate his personal shield during battle? Chapter 1097. This was the third time in Gahan's life that he had killed someone. Although there were countless lives that had died in Gahan's hands, almost all of these lives were Yuan Ko's. The only people who had truly died in Gahan's hands were that old man in Yuzhong City and a scourge of the underworld. Other than that, Gahan had never killed another human. Even when he had been greatly wronged in Shanhai Pass, Gahan had never harmed another human's life. However, Gahan didn't want to tolerate this Shi Juan anymore. Therefore, killing Shi Juan in front of an immortal sword tier sword wielder was definitely a very wrong decision. This way, Gu Xianyuan would definitely be wanted by the Sword Committee for the rest of her life. One had to know that the Sword Committee strictly forbade sword wielder from killing each other. Even if your entire family was killed by a sword wielder, you had to file a complaint to the Sword Committee, and the Discipline Committee would arrest and capture your enemy. It was definitely not allowed to kill a sword wielder without permission. If sword wielder killed each other, it would mean that the harmonious atmosphere of humanity that the Sword Committee strived to build would be broken. The trust between people would also be greatly damaged, so the Sword Committee would definitely not allow this to happen. Even if you were a spirit or immortal sword tier sword wielder, the Sword Committee would still send out a powerful immortal sword tier sword wielder, or even the Jindy himself, to capture this criminal. Of course, if this matter was done discreetly enough that the Sword Committee couldn't find any evidence, then the Sword Committee wouldn't say anything. In fact, even if they were sure that you were the one who did it, the Sword Committee would still pretend that they hadn't seen it, because you were a spirit or immortal sword tier sword wielder. But the problem was that Gu Xianyuan had killed Shi Jiuan in front of Sword Immortal Ling Su. Moreover, Shi Jiuan wasn't just a small sword wielder, but also a spirit sword tier sword wielder and the head of the Jinni family. When this happened, Gu Xianyuan was already destined to become the target of the entire human race. You actually killed someone? You actually killed someone. Sword Immortal Ling Su exclaimed. He didn't think that Gu Xianyuan would dare to kill someone right in front of him. Just as mentioned before, humans were very strict when it came to killing one another. No swordsman dared to kill another swordsman under the watchful eyes of the public. This would mean that the swordsman would be hunted down by the sword committee. In Sword Immortal Ling Su's entire life, he had never encountered a situation where a sword wielder killed someone right in front of him. Even after seeing Shi Jiyuan's head fly into the air, Sword Immortal Ling Su still felt that Sword Immortal Ling Su might not be dead. This Gu Xianyuan was only using an illusion technique. She didn't dare to actually kill Shi Jiyuan. That's right. This Gu Xianyuan must have known that he was an immortal sword rank sword wielder and had an immortal sword rank medical pod. As long as he had a head, he could revive the other party within 5 minutes. That was why he dared to cut off Shi Jiyuan's head so viciously. This thought had just appeared in Sword Immortal Ling Su's mind when it was completely destroyed by a streak of sword chi that followed closely behind. This streak of sword chi sliced Shi Jiyuan's head into a pile of minced meat without hesitation. This time, Shi Jiyuan had completely lost any chance of revival. You woman? Are you crazy? You actually dared to kill someone. Do you know what kind of consequences you'll face? Sword Immortal Ling Su questioned Gu Xianyuan in an incredulous tone as he stared at the bloodless Gu Xianyuan in front of him. Even now, Sword Immortal Ling Su still hadn't recovered from his shock. This woman really killed someone. So what if I killed him? Gu Xianyuan said disdainfully. Some people don't even kill an ant on the surface, but a single decision of theirs can cause the deaths of millions or even tens of millions of people. How can I not kill this kind of bastard who doesn't directly kill a single person, but indirectly causes the deaths of countless people? If I kill this be asterisk star today, tens of millions of people in Yuzhong City will be saved. I can't be more than happy about this outcome. So what's there to regret? You. Sword Immortal Ling Su was stunned. He didn't think that Gu Xianyuan would still be able to speak so righteously after killing someone. Then you can collect evidence and report everything to the Sword Commission headquarters. I believe that the Sword Commission headquarters will definitely give you a satisfactory answer. Sword Commission headquarters? Gu Xianyuan sneered disdainfully. What did Shi Jiyuan do wrong? At most, it would be a mistake in decision-making. At worst, he would be scolded by netizens on the internet and ordered by the Sword Committee to reflect at home. After 2 or 3 years, he would be able to jump out and show off his strength again. The Sword Commission headquarters can't really impose any severe punishment for a mistake like this. Otherwise, all those decision-makers from ancient times to the present would all be hung on the gallows. Sword Immortal Ling Su had nothing to say. He knew that Gu Xianyuan was right. Even if Gu Xianyuan produced irrefutable evidence, even if Shi Jiyuan received the most fair trial for his crimes, Shi Jiyuan had merely made a mistake in decision-making. As a leader, there were times when they made mistakes in decision-making. This was something that no one could avoid. If a leader had to be punished for a serious crime because of a mistake in decision-making, then which leader in this world would be able to live in peace? After all, even the leaders of the Sword Commission headquarters had times when they made mistakes in decision-making. When that time came, will they be sentenced to death? Do you know what kind of ending you will face if you use this sword? Sword Immortal Ling Su took a deep breath. Setting aside how many immortal sword rank or even emperor sword rank sword bearers will come after you, do you have the confidence to escape from me? As Sword Immortal Ling Su's voice fell, the Wangshu sword behind him instantly broke through the void. The entire sword lady walked into the void, and Gu Xianyuan completely lost her connection to the Wangshu sword. The void had always been Gohan's greatest weakness. Even though she had become a spirit sword rank sword bearer now, Gu Xianyuan had no way of attacking an opponent hidden in the void. She could only passively defend, and any defense would be broken one day. So she really fought with Sword Immortal Ling Su now. Then Gahan was bound to face great trouble. Then let's fight, Gu Xianyuan said expressionlessly, as if this Wangshu sword hidden in the void posed no threat to her. But after a long time, Gu Xianyuan still did not receive an attack from the void. Could it be that this Wangshu sword is testing my patience? Gohan thought to himself. He did not dare to let down his guard in the slightest, because if he let down his guard even a little, it was very likely that the Wangshu sword would come charging out from the void and deal a fatal blow to him, who was currently unprotected. Forget it, you can go. Suddenly, Sword Immortal Ling Su let out a long sigh. Then, the void beside Sword Immortal Ling Su was broken again. The Wangshu sword walked out of the void of its own accord and stood behind Sword Immortal Ling Su again. You're letting me go? Don't you want to capture me? After all, I killed a person right in front of you. I killed a swordsman, and I killed the patriarch of an Emperor Sword family. Gohan could tell that this Sword Immortal Ling Su really wanted to let him go. This surprised Gahan, because this was an outcome that Gahan did not expect. First of all, now is the most dangerous time for Yuzhong City. You were able to kill Shi Juan with a single strike, so I'm afraid that your battle prowess is second only to mine in Yuzhong City. If the two of us fight, it will definitely be an earth-shattering battle. This will not do Yuzhong City any good. If the two of us fight to the point where both of us are injured, then who will protect Yuzhong City? So I can't fight you. I only have one enemy at the moment, and that is that damned giant dragon, Sword Immortal Ling Su said with a long sigh. Second of all, I have long since disliked this guy. He is too selfish, so selfish that even I am about to be infected by his selfishness. Selfish people are the kind of people I hate the most. Thanks to your sword, otherwise I would have gradually become the kind of person I hate the most. So you can leave. I won't fight you, nor will I capture you. But I will report your actions today to the Sword Committee headquarters. As for how the Sword Committee headquarters will act, that is not my concern. Many thanks. Sword Immortal Ling Su's words caused Gohan's heart to tremble. Gohan, who had originally despaired over the internal strife of humans, suddenly realized that humans were actually still good. There were still rational people in the majority. After all, there was only one brute like Shi Juan. After all, humans were a race that always stood in the darkness and yearned for the light. At this moment, Gohan's heart surged with admiration for Sword Immortal Ling Su. It was a kind of admiration that came from the depths of his heart. Most of the swordsmen were still good. This was very important to Gohan, because only such humans were worthy of Gohan's rescue. Gohan did not want to save a bunch of animals in the end. Looks like leaving Yuzhong City to you was indeed a good choice, Senior Ling Su. A smile appeared on Gu Xuanyuan's face, like a brilliant spring flower blooming in April or May. Sword Immortal Ling Su couldn't help but feel a sense of intoxication as he murmured to himself, "Wow, I think I'm seeing that wild chrysanthemum on Ryu's head again." Who is Ryu? He didn't think that Gu Xianyuan would hear Sword Immortal Ling Su's quiet murmur to himself. Gu Xianyuan took the initiative to ask. Ryu is the love of my life. Back then, I couldn't afford flowers, so I could only risk my life to pluck a wild chrysanthemum from outside the city and bring it to her head. Unfortunately, she was unlucky. Before I could become a swordsman, she had already died from terminal illness. If I could have become a swordsman earlier, then I would definitely have the ability to get the best doctors and equipment to treat her. Perhaps then she wouldn't have died. Unfortunately, I was still one step too late. Sword Immortal Ling Su said with a bitter smile that was tinged with nostalgia. To be honest, Gohan was feeling very bad right now. Then do you still want the Sword Maidens in my hands? Gu Xianyuan asked again. No need. Sword Immortal Ling Su waved his hand. I do have my own selfish motives. If Yuzhong City can't be defended in the end, then please give all the Sword Maidens to your little brother. He will definitely be able to protect these Sword Maidens. Oh, and your little brother's disciple, that little girl named Lu Shihua. She has been sent by Sir Juan to London City by road. He says he wants to make amends on your little brother's behalf. Just let your little brother personally go to London City. I've met Long Sir Jindy before. He's actually a very good person. He won't make things difficult for your little brother. At the very least, he won't kill him like you did. Sword Immortal Ling Su revealed a self-deprecating smile and left the sword pavilion without another word. At this moment, only Gu Xianyuan was left in the sword pavilion. Guhan gazed at the brand-new dimensional pocket in his hand. This was the dimensional pocket that he used to store the sword maidens. With me here, Yuzhong City is as stable as Mount Tai. Chapter 1098. At this moment, on the walls of the core area, tens of thousands of sword-bearers were filled with confusion and sorrow. At this moment, outside Yang Fortress, there were already countless Yuan Ko's. The news that Yuan Ko's army was attacking Yuzhong City could no longer be hidden. A large amount of information had been transmitted through the internet to every sword-bearer in Yuzhong City, and even to the personal terminals of every civilian. As time passed, the energy of the core area's dimensional barrier continued to decline under the watchful eyes of all the sword-bearers. All the sword-bearers gradually felt despair, although the rate of energy decline was not high. With the arrival of Yuan Ko's army, the dimensional barrier in the core area would inevitably suffer several times the damage. When that time came, the core area would only end up being breached. If the sword-bearers in the core area only felt despair at this time, but in reality, there was still the dimensional barrier to protect their safety. As for the ordinary people in the underground shelter of Yuzhong City, all they had left was indescribable fear. They could see the scene on the surface of Yuzhong City through the video system of the shelter. They had already seen about 1/20th of their homes turn into piles of rubble under the destruction of the lightning dragon. They also saw that the ordinary areas of Yuzhong City were protected by the magnificent city walls, but the superdimensional barrier outside the walls had disappeared, and there was not a single sword-bearer on the city walls. As long as Yuan Ko's army arrived, everyone's homes would be destroyed in an instant. Then, these Yuan Ko's would frantically attack underground until they dug out the shelter hidden hundreds of meters deep. Then, they would eat the people in the shelter as food. This had happened too many times in the history of Yuzhong City. Every time Yuzhong City's superdimensional barrier was breached, the ordinary people of Yuzhong City would suffer an indescribable, cruel disaster. However, the people of Yuzhong City did not expect that just 3 years after the last disaster, this disaster would come one after another. This had never happened in the history of Yuzhong City. It could even be said that in the entire history of mankind, there was no base city whose superdimensional barrier had not been breached twice in 3 years. Where's Hao Tianjini? Where's Long Sir Jindy? Where is our sword Immortal Ling Su? There were so many sword bearers, but where were they? Why didn't they come to save us? Every sanctuary was filled with such questions. These ordinary people could not understand why there was not an Emperor Sword Wielder to help them. If there had been an Emperor Sword Wielder to help them, that damn dragon would not have been so arrogant. Yuzhong City's superdimensional defense system would not have been broken. But where were the Emperor Sword Wielder? Didn't they promise to protect Yuzhong City? Everyone, stop making wild guesses. Don't forget how Guhan dealt with Long Sir Jindy's son. It must be because Guhan offended Long Sir Jindy. So Long Sir Jindy is not willing to save us. This is all that Guhan's fault. Guhan harmed us. These ordinary people did not know that Hao Tianjini had entered the state of ascension, and Long Sir Jindy was restrained by several flood-level Yuan Ko. They could only use their own logic to turn their various doubts into speculations, and finally came up with a very reasonable answer. It was Guhan who harmed them. It was Guhan who harmed Long Sir Jindy. He was not willing to save them. It was all Guhan's fault. Of course, at this moment, Guhan did not know that such emotions were pervading the underground. After mending the walls of the sword pavilion, he walked toward the city wall with firm steps. Now that the most powerful sword lady of the spirit sword level was in the hands of Guhan and Shurjin, this great scourge, had also died in his hands, Gahan had no reason to wait any longer. He wanted to kill this dragon with his own hands to protect the safety of his beloved Yuzhong city. When Gahan walked up the city wall, he found that at this time, all the people on the city wall were focused on the sky. Everyone raised their necks high, and their faces were full of concern and anxiety. Gahan followed these people and looked up at the sky. He found that in addition to the white thunder and lightning dragon, there was also a beautiful girl in a blue long sleeve standing opposite this dragon. In front of this huge dragon, the girl was as small as a grain of rice. However, the aura around the girl did not show any fear. Although the girl was defeated by this dragon in less than 10 minutes a few days ago, she was not afraid at all. It's the Wangshu Sword Lady. The Wangshu Sword Lady has finally appeared. Seeing the girl appear, all the sword bearers on the city wall immediately cheered. With this immortal sword lady here, the sword bearers immediately felt a sense of security. At the same time, everyone was desperately praying that the Wangshu Sword Lady would be able to defeat this damned dragon and save Yuzhong City, which was on the verge of destruction. Hearing the sword bearers' cheers, the Wangshu Sword Lady gritted her teeth and instantly disappeared into the void. In the next second, she appeared at the back of the thunder and lightning dragon's head. At the same time, a faint yellow light suddenly appeared on the Wangshu Sword Lady's blue blade. Even the sky seemed to dim under the yellow light. Then, the Wangshu Sword Lady gripped the hilt with both hands and stabbed the blade into the back of the thunder and lightning dragon's head. Bakayaxi! This attack seemed to have really injured the thunder and lightning dragon. Suddenly, the thunder and lightning dragon let out an incomprehensible cry. Its snow-white scales were also stained with a faint yellow glow, as if the entire thunder and lightning dragon had been enveloped by the faint yellow glow. And as the thunder and lightning dragon was enveloped by the faint yellow glow, the lightning that had been descending ceaselessly around her suddenly stopped. And with the disappearance of the lightning, the energy strength of the dimensional barrier in the core area finally came to a stop. Instead, it began to rise slowly. However, this increase was very small, only increasing by about 0.005% per second. Although the increase was very small, it was enough for the sword bearers to cheer. They had already had enough of the dimensional barrier's constant decline. Now, they finally saw an opportunity to change the situation. Looks like this is the Wangshu Sword's basic skill, Hazy Moonlight. Seeing the situation before him, Gahan muttered to himself. Hazy Moonlight was the Wangshu Sword's basic skill. The skill's effect was that it could borrow the moonlight to attack, allowing the moonlight to strengthen the Wangshu Sword's damage. At the same time, the attack had a certain chance of enveloping the opponent in moonlight, causing them to fall into a stagnant state. The stronger the moonlight, the stronger the skill's effect. So, the yellow light that had enveloped the thunder and lightning dragon was the moonlight that the Wangshu Sword had borrowed. The Wangshu Sword had once said in a public program that it was actually the incarnation of the moon. Its power was the moon's power. The stronger the moonlight, the stronger its power. Everyone might find this strange. It was broad daylight and there was no moon. Where did the Wangshu Sword borrow moonlight? According to common sense, the sun rose and the moon set in the day, and the moon rose and the sun set at night. The two constantly alternated, forming day and night. So, there was no moon during the day and no sun at night. But this was actually a fallacy. The sun might not be visible at night, but even during the day, the moon was still hanging in the sky. It was just that the sun's light was too strong during the day, and the moon's light was reflected from the sun's light. The light of the moon during the day was covered by the sun's light, but the moonlight still existed during the day. At this time, although the sun was still hanging high in the sky, it was actually approaching dusk. The moonlight actually existed in the sunlight. The light of the two couldn't be distinguished with the naked eye, but it was enough for the Wangshu Sword, the incarnation of the moon. The Wangshu Sword could still borrow the moonlight to fight. Of course, the moonlight was still too weak, so the effects of the hazy moonlight skill weren't obvious. After tightly binding the thunder and lightning dragon for about 2 seconds, the faint yellow light around the thunder and lightning dragon disappeared. The stagnant lightning once again bombarded the dimensional barrier. The energy strength of the dimensional barrier in the core region also began to decline. More importantly, the Wangshu sword, which had been riding on the thunder and lightning dragon's head, had been thrown out. The Wangshu sword lady, who had been thrown out, quickly adjusted her body and floated in the air again. The Wangshu sword, which had been stuck in the thunder and lightning dragon's head, instantly returned to the Wangshu sword lady's hand. Because of the previous attack, the thunder and lightning dragon no longer ignored the tiny person in front of it. Instead, it narrowed its large, round eyes and glared at the tiny Wangshu sword lady. It asked in a childish voice, "Baddie, why did you bully Kong Na? How did I bully you? You were the one who destroyed our city, weren't you?" Wangshu sword was dumbfounded by the thunder and lightning dragon Kong Na's question. It didn't expect the thunder and lightning dragon Kong Na to have the cheek to say that it bullied her. This fellow was a flood-level Yuan Ko. Did it have to act cute? "Of course you bullied Kong Na," Kong Na said in a very aggrieved tone. Kong Na was hungry and wanted to find something to eat, but you hid the delicious food in the eggshell. Kong Na asked you to open the eggshell, but you refused. You even took the initiative to bully Kong Na. Kong Na had no choice but to break the eggshell. Both the Wangshu sword and the sword bearers were infuriated by Kong Na's aggrieved look. That's right, this run-level Yuan bandit didn't make a move the moment he appeared. Instead, he made a request. But the problem was that Kong Na, the flood-level Yuan Ko's request, was for humans to open their dimensional barrier and let her in to eat. Unless everyone's brains were collectively buffed, no human would agree to such a request. Chapter 1099. Oh no, you're bullying Kong Na. Kong Na flapped her wings forcefully. You're all bad guys. Oh no, I'm hungry. Hurry up and open the eggshell. I'm hungry. I'm so hungry. Kong Na let out a series of hungry dragon roars, urging the humans to open the dimensional barrier and let her in to eat. Yuan Ko is too hateful. She actually wants to use such a childish trick to deceive us. We must not be fooled by her, although she looks quite cute. Whether it was the Wangshu sword in the air or the sword bearers on the city wall, they were all enraged by Kong Na's childish trick. Was she insulting the intelligence of humans? That's right. Maybe this Yuan Ko is really hungry and wants to come in to find food. But her food is us humans. Everyone, work together and swear to protect the dimensional barrier. We must not let our dimensional barrier be destroyed by her. A series of loud shouts came from the sword bearers. They were all enraged by Kong Na's childish deception. It was like a big bad wolf telling a little white rabbit, "Little rabbit, be good and open the door. I want to come in. I'm your mother." However, standing on the city wall, Gahan had a completely different idea. This thunder dragon had been sealed by Lu Yinyua's ancestors for hundreds of years, so it was self-evident how hungry she was. Wanting to come to Yuzhong City to find food might also be what she really meant. Moreover, Gahan was sure that this thunder dragon did not like humans as food. Otherwise, she wouldn't have spat out Li Xiangtian, who was halfway through her meal, and wouldn't have let him, Shang Yi, and the others go. Gahan had a faint feeling that perhaps this thunder dragon did not really want to destroy Yuzhong City. What she said was actually the truth. However, the current situation did not allow Gahan to make such a guess. In the sky, the Wangshu sword did not believe Kong Na's childish lie at all. Its blade was once again enveloped in pale yellow moonlight, ready to use hazy moonlight to teach this damned Yuan Ko a lesson. So annoying, so annoying. Kong Na saw the yellow moonlight on the Wangshu sword's blade and remembered the feeling of being sealed. She immediately became irritable. A dozen lightning bolts instantly struck Wangshu sword's head, ready to strike this annoying sword lady to death. Insignificant skill. How dare you compete with the bright moon? Wangshu Jian coldly snorted, and the void gate opened. In the blink of an eye, Wangshu Jian entered the void, and the dozen or so lightning bolts naturally struck empty air. Other than some beautiful sparks, nothing was left. Oh, incredible! Seeing the Wangshu sword suddenly disappear into the void, Kong Na exclaimed, "Oh no!" Immediately after, arcs of electric sparks began to appear on her snow-white wings. "It's here!" The Wangshu sword, who was hiding in the void, confirmed the location of Thunder and Lightning Dragon Kong Na's head. It was prepared to charge out from the void and stab Kong Na through the wound it had just inflicted, rubbing salt on the wound. But before Wangshu's sword could jump out of the void, he felt a violent numbness. He could no longer control his body and fell out of the void. A snow-white dragon claw grabbed him. "What happened? Why can't I move?" Wangshu's sword, who was in the void, did not know what had just happened, but Gahan, who was on the city wall, saw the entire process clearly. He did not expect this thunder dragon to have the ability to attack the void. Just now, the lightning arcs on her wings had secretly broken through the void to attack Wangshu's sword in the void. All of Wangshu's sword's attention was focused on Kong Na's head. He did not expect Kong Na's lightning arcs to be able to penetrate the void to attack him. What's more, these lightning arcs had a powerful numbing effect. So Wangshu's sword was immediately numbed by Kong Na's lightning arcs. Then, Kong Na broke through the void beside Wangshu's sword, causing Wangshu's sword to fall out of the void. She grabbed it firmly in her hand. "Damn it!" Wangshu's sword cursed. After a full 3 to 4 seconds, her body recovered from the numbness. She was about to use hazy moonlight on the dragon claw that had grabbed her, then use the binding power of the moonlight to break free from the Thunder Dragon's claw. Although the Wangshu sword was a powerful immortal sword rank sword mistress, her opponent was a flood rank Yuenko, who was even stronger than the immortal sword rank sword mistress. The Wangshu sword's attack speed was far slower than Kong Na's electric discharge. Therefore, when the Wangshu sword empress raised the Wangshu sword in her hand, another electric spark with an intense numbing effect struck the Wangshu sword, causing the poor Wangshu sword to enter a state of paralysis once again. As a result, the Wangshu sword fell into an extremely tragic situation. Every time the numbing effect ended and Wangshu sword was about to break free from the dragon claw, the next numbing effect came as planned. This cycle repeated. Wangshu's sword entered a state of numbness again and again. This lasted for dozens of rounds. So in the end, Wangshu's sword's entire body was numb. Even when the numbness ended, she could not be bothered to struggle anymore. And Kong Na seemed to find great joy in this. As she used lightning to destroy the core dimensional barrier, she repeatedly numbed Wangshu's sword. The Wangshu sword empress became Kong Na's best toy. Once a child found a toy that could satisfy her, she could happily play with it for an entire year. Of course, a year might be an exaggeration, but an afternoon was enough. Seeing the guardian of their city, the only immortal sword maiden, being controlled by this damned dragon in just a few moves and being toyed with so crazily, the self-esteem of the majority of Yuzhong City's sword-bearers suffered a severe blow. Many of them wanted to order their sword maidens to rush forward and save Wangshu's sword maiden. But when they thought that their sword maidens might not even be able to withstand a small bolt of lightning from this flood-tier Yuan Ko, they immediately suppressed the thought of ordering their sword maidens to rush forward. Didn't they see that the other spiritual sword maidens did not make a move to rescue her? Then why were they, who were mere ancient sword maidens and treasure sword bearers, rushing to the front? So at this moment, what were those spiritual sword maidens or their sword bearers doing? In short, they were having a meeting. Of course, they were not having a meeting to discuss whether they should save Wangshu's sword maiden or not. They did not have the guts to directly say that they did not want to save Wangshu's sword maiden. These spiritual sword bearers were having a meeting to discuss how to save Wangshu's sword maiden. This was a meeting that was very difficult to reach a conclusion, especially when most of the spiritual sword bearers went to the meeting with their own selfish motives. It was even more impossible for this meeting to reach a consensus. These spiritual sword bearers were not fools. They clearly knew what it meant to ask the spiritual sword maidens to rescue the immortal sword maidens from the dragon tier Yuan Ko. Even if they could save the Wangshu sword goddess in the end, the sword ladies of the spirit sword level would definitely suffer great injuries in the end. There is a possibility that some of the sword ladies of the spirit sword level might even be broken. As a result, the suggestions put forward by every spirit sword level sword bearer were almost all suggestions that were beneficial to themselves and not beneficial to others, and such suggestions were naturally not supported by others. Thus, this meeting fell into endless wrangling. However, to everyone's surprise, the wielder of the Wangshu sword immortal Ling Su, remained outside of the conference this entire time. Instead, he looked on with a look of despair in his eyes, which were filled with meaningless discussions. He suddenly felt a little regretful. He regretted colluding with Shi Jueyuan. Otherwise, he would not be seeing such a scene at this moment. This was the root of the disaster left behind by Shi Jueyuan. One had to know that when Liu Lei was in power, although Yuzhong City was not strong enough, there was no lack of hot-blooded sword-bearers. Even in the face of certain death, a large number of sword-bearers would stand up and fight with Yuan Ko, using their lives to prove their lifelong beliefs. However, after Shi Jueyuan took control of the overall situation of Yuzhong City, the entire city changed. This was because Shi Jueyuan could not use his own strength to control Yuzhong City like Liu Lei, so he could only use political trickery. The core secret of Shi Jueyuan's political trickery was the meeting. Through the meeting, he could prolong the decision-making time, and through the meeting, he could beat the patience of those who were reckless and disagreeable to him. At the same time, by constantly roping in a majority and beating a small group of people, he finally took control of the meeting in his own hands, and then controlled the entire Yuzhong City. It could be said that there was nothing wrong with Shi Jueyuan's political trickery. In peaceful times, this was also the only way to fight for power. However, after the Great Apocalypse, there had never been an era of peace for humans. They were at war all the time, and any delay in a decision could lead to the failure of the war. Looking at the history of human war for thousands of years, one would find that, with the same level of technology, a country controlled by a dictator could always beat a so-called peaceful democratic country with a parliamentary system. Just like the mustache Nazi king who beat the whole of Europe, if it wasn't for the fact that the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Red Soviet Union were also controlled by three powerful dictators, the final fate of World War II would have been unknown. As a result, after Shi Jueyuan successfully controlled the power of Yuzhong City through endless meetings, most of the spirit sword level sword bearers in Yuzhong City were also corrupted along with Shi Jueyuan. In the past 3 years, they had become accustomed to winning through secret political struggles, and the flame of battle that originally existed in their hearts had been extinguished. Some of them had even not fought in the city in the past 3 years, and their sword essence had not increased. They were all immersed in endless meetings and struggles. This was the worst result that Shi Jueyuan had brought to Yuzhong City. At this time, although Shi Jueyuan had died in the hands of Gahan, the poison he left behind had not disappeared. Instead, it was still constantly scourging the city. When Sword Immortal Ling Su had just taken over as the chairman of the Yuzhong City Sword Committee, he had wanted to change this situation, but his spirit was worn down by Shi Jueyuan's meeting tactics. In the end, Shi Jueyuan generously extended his olive branch, indicating that he was willing to share a little power with Sword Immortal Ling Su, and Sword Immortal Ling Su unknowingly colluded with Shi Jueyuan. Now, the consequences of colluding with Shi Jueyuan had appeared. Sword Immortal Ling Su had to face the consequences of no one being willing to save his Wangshu sword. Chapter 1100. Just as Immortal Sword Ling Su was feeling remorseful, Guhan couldn't hold back anymore. He didn't plan on watching Wangshu sword suffer in the hands of this lightning dragon. Just as Gahan was about to rush out with his sword to save Wangshu's sword, a sword light suddenly flew up from the city wall and directly collided with the lightning dragon's claw. The lightning dragon Kong, Na, was caught off guard, and her dragon claw loosened slightly from the impact. Wang Shujian immediately took advantage of this opportunity to break free from the dragon claw and stood in front of the lightning dragon Kong Na in a somewhat sorry state. Who is it? Who saved Wang Shu Sword Dame? Seeing Wang Shu Sword Dame break free from the dragon's claw, the sword bearers on the city wall first cheered, and then they began to guess which sword lady it was. However, the sudden sword light appeared like a shooting star and disappeared like a shooting star. After saving Wang Shu Jinyang, the sword light directly fell back to the core area and was caught by a sword wielder who held it in his arms. It's the Tiger Roar Sword Spirit. At this time, everyone realized that it was the Tiger Roar Sword Spirit that had saved Wang Shu Sword Lady at the critical moment. Some people suddenly remembered. Wasn't the Spirit Sword Lady of the Tiger Roar Sword Spirit the gigantic K sword? And the ultimate move of the gigantic K sword only had one word, K. Almost every sword bearer who was familiar with the Sword Lady knew the effect of this move. K was a move used to destroy everything. It consumed all the energy of the Sword Lady's protective shield and 10% of the sword bearer's sword element limit, causing 500% true damage of the energy consumed and the sword element limit. The so-called true damage was the damage caused by ignoring defense. As a huge dragon, the lightning dragon's defense was extremely high. An ordinary attack on her body would probably cause less than 5% of the damage. The gigantic K sword's attack ignored defense. At the same time, it also condensed all the energy of the gigantic K sword spirit's protective shield and 10% of the sword element limit of a spirit sword bearer. The damage of this attack was undoubtedly huge. Even a flood-level Yuan Ko's Dragon Claw was inevitably injured after being hit by the gigantic K-sword. A huge wound of about 10 meters appeared on Kong Na's Dragon Claw. Milky white dragon blood dripped out of the wound like a waterfall and quickly formed a small pool on the ground. This was probably the most serious injury the dragon had suffered since it appeared in Yuzhong City. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been unable to control Wang Shu Sword Dame and let her out. However, the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit had paid a huge price for this. He had permanently lost 1/10 of the sword element he had accumulated over his lifetime. The Howling Tiger Sword Spirit would need to spend at least 3 years to make up for this lost 1/10. Howling Tiger Sword Spirit. Sword Immortal Ling Su hurriedly rushed to the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit's side. As an immortal sword bearer, Sword Immortal Ling Su looked at the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit with a face full of shame. He looked like he wanted to find a hole to hide in. Even his speech had become extremely sluggish. The reason for this was not hard to imagine. A few days ago, it was because of Sword Immortal Ling Su's compromise and cooperation that Shi Juin was able to successfully remove the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit from the position of Dean of Yuzhong University. But now, the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit had disregarded their past enmity and helped Sword Immortal Ling Su rescue the Wang Shu sword. Where would Sword Immortal Ling Su put his old face? Master, no need to thank me. At this moment, the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit's expression was extremely ugly. It seemed that in addition to permanently losing 1/10 of the sword element limit, this attack had also taken a huge toll on the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit's body. Master, this is all I can do. If you really want to thank me, please protect Yuzhong City until the very last moment. Even if I have to sacrifice my old life, it will be worth it, the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit said with a sincere and resolute expression. I understand. Sword Immortal Ling Su nodded solemnly. Just for the sake of the Howling Tiger Sword Spirit's friendship, he, Sword Immortal Ling Su, could not abandon Yuzhong City. Wang Shu, prepare to receive my extreme Shi. Sword Immortal Ling Su took a deep breath, then said to the Wang Shu sword hovering in the air. Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su's words, Wang Shu sword's eyes instantly dimmed. It asked hesitantly, Ling Su, do we really have to do this? Sword Immortal Ling Su nodded. But don't you dislike this city? Why do you want to do this for this city? Wang Shu's sword asked in confusion. I didn't like it before, but I do now. Sword Immortal Ling Su chuckled. Besides, since I'm sitting in this position, I should at least do something within my power for the sake of this position, right? But this isn't something you can do. You know what the consequences of doing this are. Wang Shu Sword Goddess clearly didn't want her sword wielder to release his extreme yin qi. In fact, she even actively tried to dissuade her sword wielder from doing so. These things don't belong to me in the first place, so why should I keep them with me and take them with me into my coffin? Sword Immortal Ling Su sank into distant memories. If we can save 40 million people, then I'm sure Ryu will be very satisfied. If that's the case, then let's do it. Wang Shu's sword goddess finally stopped trying to dissuade her sword wielder. At the same time, Sword Immortal Ling Su suddenly made a strange pose in front of everyone. His body curled up like a baby in a mother's womb, and he slowly floated up from the ground. A faint blue light seeped out from Sword Immortal Ling Su's body bit by bit, transforming into tiny fireflies that flew toward Wang Shu's sword goddess in the sky. In the end, they all seeped into Wang Shu's sword goddess's body. At the same time, some of the sword wielder discovered to their astonishment that the moon in the sky was gradually revealing its true form. Immediately, all the moonlight within a radius of several hundred kilometers around Yuzhong City disappeared, but the moonlight in the sky above Yuzhong City became extremely dense. After absorbing these faint blue fireflies, Wang Shu's sword goddess's entire aura changed. If the Wang Shu sword goddess was like a gentle celestial maiden before, then she had now become a domineering queen mother. Under the faint blue light, she appeared so noble, so cold, and so emotionless. As the blue light on Wang Shu's sword goddess's body flickered to its peak, the moonlight in the sky also became extremely dense. It transformed into a beam of light that shot directly into Wang Shu's sword goddess's body. Blurred moonlight. Wang Shu's sword goddess's painstaking preparation time finally came to an end. Her body instantly exploded, and over 100 light needles flew out in a straight line from where Wang Shu's sword goddess had exploded. These light needles then flew in different directions, forming faint yellow streaks of light in their wake. These light needles seemed to be controlled by a nimble goddess. In a short span of 3 or 4 seconds, they had woven a huge, faint yellow net of light in the sky. This net of light seemed to have been woven from moonlight. This was clearly a net of moonlight. What kind of technique is this? I've never seen such a beautiful technique before. All of the sword wielder were stunned by this technique. This net of moonlight was so beautiful. They had never thought that a technique used by a sword goddess could be this beautiful. This seems to be Wang Shu's sword goddess's advanced technique, blurred moonlight. Someone immediately used their personal terminal to furiously search for information on Wang Shu's sword goddess. Finally, they found the origins of this moonlight net. This technique was Wang Shu's sword goddess's advanced technique, blurred moonlight. Depending on how much sword essence the Wang Shu sword goddess had, she could gather all the moonlight in a different area into her body. Then, she would use this moonlight to weave a moonlight net, which would then be used to restrain her enemies. The power of this technique lay in the fact that the moonlight net had a 100% hit rate. Even if it was a flood class or desolate class Yuan Ko, they would definitely be controlled by this moonlight net. And while being controlled by the moonlight net, the controlled opponent would suffer a certain percentage of damage every second. As for the specific value of the control time and the percentage of damage, it was determined by the difference in strength between the opponents. The greater the difference in strength, the longer or shorter the control time. Sword Immortal Ling Su was an immortal sword wielder, while the Lightning Dragon was a flood class Yuan Ko. The difference between them was like the difference between heaven and earth. Thus, the majority of the sword wielder were not optimistic about the duration of the moonlight net's control. At most, they could only control it for a few seconds and deal a pitiful amount of damage to the Lightning Dragon. Would such a move really be effective against the Lightning Dragon? Just as the majority of the sword wielder were half believing and half doubting, the moonlight net had already spread to its limit. The entire net instantly enveloped the lightning dragon. Seeing this faint yellow net envelop itself, the lightning dragon Kong Na felt threatened. She sensed a power within this large net that she hated. Oh no! Void! Open! Kong Na was also a Yuan Ko that could travel through the void. Thus, the moment this large net enveloped her, Kong Na gave up on continuing to use lightning to attack the dimensional barrier. Instead, she fled into the void, attempting to use the void to avoid this large net's attack. Logically speaking, this was a very correct decision. The void could indeed avoid more than 99% of attacks. However, just like Kong Na's electric sparks that could sneak into the void, this moonlight net could also sneak into the void. Thus, the two disappeared from the sword wielder's field of vision at the same time. I wonder if it can trap this damned Yuan Ko. Please, you must succeed. The sword bearers on the city walls were frantically injecting their sword essences into the dimensional wall to replenish the energy of the dimensional wall that was constantly decreasing. At the same time, they prayed to Kinzu, praying that Lady Wangshu Jian would succeed in trapping this Yuan Ko. Finally, there was another fluctuation in the sky, and the void was forcefully torn open again. That damn thunder and lightning dragon Kong Na had been tightly bound by the moonlight net. She was dragged out of the void and slammed heavily on the dimensional barrier, causing waves of fluctuations in the dimensional barrier. Long live! All the sword wielder instantly cheered, as if they had already won this battle. Chapter 1101. Although the Thunder Dragon Kong Na was captured by the moonlight net, she was not willing to accept defeat and was still struggling in the net. The pale yellow moonlight on the surface of the moonlight net constantly changed into small light swords. These light swords constantly pierced into Kong Na's body, creating small wounds on the surface of Kong Na's body. Although these wounds were very small, there were too many of them, so the surface of Kong Na's body was soon covered with her own pure white blood. The whole dragon looked as if she had been sprayed with an unknown white liquid. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 3 minutes. Time passed by. This moonlight net did not last for only a few seconds, as the other sword bearers had imagined, but it continued continuously. The damage Kong Na received was also increasing. The pure white dragon blood that flowed out of her body had converged from a small pond into a large lake, submerging several ordinary residential areas. Such a large amount of blood loss was almost half of the Thunder Dragon's HP. Although they didn't know what such a loss meant for a dragon, for a human, losing half of her HP was definitely a fatal loss. Hooray! Hooray! This was the first time that Kong Na had suffered such a serious injury, and it was an absolutely fatal injury, so the sword bearers cheered even more excitedly. This time, they really saw victory. The spirit sword level sword bearers who were still in a meeting just now also cheered, but the flesh on their faces was very stiff, and it could be seen that these smiles were forced. They had no idea that Sword Immortal Ling Su was so powerful that he could completely control the flood-level Yuan Ko by himself. In this way, all the wrangling just now had fallen into the eyes of Sword Immortal Ling Su. They believed that after this battle was over, Sword Immortal Ling Su would definitely not let them go. The only spirit sword level sword bearer who showed a sincere smile was the Tiger Roar Sword spirit. He felt that his efforts were not in vain, so he showed a sincere smile. But Gahan on the city wall could not smile. Whether it was a fake smile or a sincere smile, he could not smile. Others might not be able to see through this trick, but Gahan could see it clearly. Gahan was well aware of the Wangshu sword's ability. Against a flood-class Yuan Ko like Kong Na, the moonlight net could only restrain her for 5 seconds at most. However, the moonlight net had already lasted for 8 minutes. Unless this thunder and lightning dragon was a fake flood-level Yuan Ko, it was impossible for the moonlight net to last so long. Guhan couldn't help but cast his gaze toward Sword Immortal Ling Su, who was still hovering in mid-air in the form of an infant with blue fireflies erupting from his body. It looked like the reason for the moonlight net's abnormality lay with sword immortal Ling Su. Gohan was certain that to use the moonlight net, he only needed to condense moonlight. He didn't need the Wangshu sword wielder to emit any blue fireflies from his body. The blue firefly clearly had the effect of strengthening the moonlight net, which was why it could last for 8 minutes. But what exactly was this blue firefly? Why could it strengthen the moonlight net? Just as Gohan was wondering about this, Sword Immortal Ling Su's body suddenly began to tremble violently. The number of blue fireflies that had been continuously supplied also began to decrease drastically. In the blink of an eye, it had almost disappeared without a trace. Not good. Looks like Sword Immortal Ling Su's blessing is almost exhausted. Gohan's guess was immediately verified. After the blue fireflies disappeared, the moonlight net that trapped the Thunder Dragon Kong Na also quickly dimmed. The faint yellow swords that were constantly condensing to attack Kong Na disappeared first. Then, the moonlight net also began to slowly fade. And at most 3 seconds, this moonlight net would completely lose its effect. Wangshu, Moonlight Impact. Sword Immortal Ling Su, who was floating in the air, let out a final roar with a ferocious expression. The moonlight net that had been about to disappear suddenly condensed back to its strongest state, and the moon hanging high up in the sky also poured its moonlight to the extreme in this instant. The moonlight net erupted with the most dazzling moonlight Gohan had ever seen in his life. The entire moonlight net tightened in an instant, and then all of it was squeezed into the body of the Thunder Dragon Kong Na. Kong Na was clearly in great pain. Her beautiful dragon eyes widened to the extreme, and her dragon mouth opened as if she wanted to cry out in pain. But in the end, Kong Na could only say, "Oh no." Then, her body exploded like a pissing meatball. Pure white dragon blood once again burst out. In the end, Kong Na could no longer maintain her flight. She fell heavily into the blood lake formed by her dripping blood, and no longer made a sound. We won. We really won. Seeing this scene, all the sword bearers looked at each other in disbelief. They didn't think that Sword Immortal Ling Su could really rely on the power of an immortal sword tier sword bearer to kill a flood-level Yuan Ko. This was even more unbelievable than a sow climbing a tree or the moon in the water. Since ancient times, other than Kenzu and Jitian Jindi, there had never been an immortal sword tier sword bearer who defeated a flood-level Yuan Ko. Could it be that Sword Immortal Ling Su was a powerful sword bearer comparable to Kenzu and Jitian Jindi? But there was no point in caring about this. A large number of sword bearers flew to Sword Immortal Ling Su's side, preparing to celebrate Sword Immortal Ling Su's victory. Sword Immortal Ling Su, who was floating in the air, suddenly fell from the sky. If it wasn't for a beautiful woman beside him who reacted quickly and caught Sword Immortal Ling Su's body, Sword Immortal Ling Su would have fallen off the city wall. What happened to Sword Immortal Ling Su? Seeing the hero of Yuzhong City suddenly fall, the surrounding sword bearers immediately asked nervously, "His situation is very bad. I'm afraid he has expended a large amount of his life force, at least 10 years of life." The beautiful woman who was holding Sword Immortal Ling Su replied, "Who are you? What right do you have to say that?" Hearing the beautiful woman's words, one of the surrounding sword bearers immediately said in dissatisfaction, "Wasn't she cursing Sword Immortal Ling Su? Whatever I say is true. Whether you believe it or not is up to you, and I don't care." The beautiful woman raised her head and said indifferently. Then, the sword bearer who had just raised a question was instantly speechless. This woman was really too beautiful, so beautiful that he forgot how to breathe. But the truth didn't need this beautiful woman to say anymore. After the beautiful woman's words fell, Sword Immortal Ling Su's originally jet black hair instantly turned silvery white. His originally full and elastic skin was now filled with all kinds of wrinkles and age spots. Without a doubt, Sword Immortal Ling Su had expended a large amount of his life force. He had already directly entered the state of old age from his original middle-aged self. "Miss Xinyuan," Sword Immortal Ling Su slowly opened his eyes, which were filled with exhaustion. When he saw Gu Xian Yuan appear beside him, a gratified expression appeared on his face. He asked weakly, "Miss Xian Yuan, have we won?" "Master Ling Su, we've won. That huge dragon has already been defeated by you." Without waiting for Gu Xian Yuan to reply, the surrounding sword bearers immediately took the initiative to answer on her behalf. "Miss Xian Yuan?" However, Sword Immortal Ling Su didn't care about the strength of these sword bearers. Instead, his gaze was fixed on Gu Xian Yuan, waiting for her to give him an answer. "I'm afraid it won't be so smooth," Gu Xian Yuan said indifferently. "That Yuan Ko isn't dead yet." "Woman, you're so beautiful. What nonsense are you spouting?" That huge dragon was clearly defeated by the Wangshu sword goddess. Everyone saw this with their own eyes. "Why do you have to say that she's not dead yet?" The surrounding sword bearers immediately retorted agitatedly. It looked like these sword bearers were completely unwilling to accept the fact that the huge dragon wasn't dead yet. "Then what proof do you have to say that she's dead?" Gu Xian Yuan humphed coldly. "Don't let your emotions get to your heads. You didn't even see the most obvious thing. Where is the dimensional vortex? If that huge dragon is really dead, where did the dimensional vortex go? Could it be that the dimensional vortex won't appear anymore?" Everyone was instantly rendered speechless by Gu Xian Yuan's words. At the same time, the joy in their hearts instantly disappeared without a trace. Could it be that it was really as this beauty had said, that the lightning dragon wasn't dead yet? Wangshu Sword. Sword Immortal Ling Su's expression also changed. With great difficulty, he called out the name of the Wangshu sword. At the same time, the moonlight net in the sky appeared once again. It gathered toward the center once more, and finally transformed back into the appearance of the Wangshu sword goddess. Just like the extremely exhausted and weak Sword Immortal Ling Su, the Wangshu sword goddess who had reappeared was also extremely weak. The protective shield around her was like a white light bulb whose filament was about to explode. In the end, it flickered a few times before completely disappearing. In such a state, the Wangshu sword goddess was definitely unable to continue fighting. However, she still stared warily at the lake of blood that Kong Na had fallen into. It was as if Kong Na could appear at any moment, and she was also prepared to continue fighting at any moment. However, the Wangshu sword goddess stood guard by the side of the lake of blood for a full 10 minutes. There was still no movement from the lake of blood. All of the spectating, sword-wielding cultivators began to discuss spiritedly among themselves. Some of them even privately accused Gu Xianyuan of exaggerating the truth and worrying about unnecessary things. She was making it so that Sword Immortal Ling Su and the Wangshu sword were unable to rest and had to fight with their injuries. However, Gu Xianyuan wasn't moved by these discussions. Instead, just like the Wangshu sword goddess, she stared intently at the lake of blood. Suddenly, amidst the commotion, a small figure tore through the void and appeared behind the Wangshu sword. This figure was far too small, and the Wangshu sword was far too exhausted. In addition, all of her attention was focused on the lake of blood. As a result, she didn't even notice that a white figure had appeared behind her. "Oh no!" This white figure raised her little fist and hammered it towards the back of the Wangshu sword's heart. Chapter 11:02. The raised fist was very small, about the size of an ordinary primary school student's fist. However, the power contained in the fist was extremely terrifying. At that moment, the Wangshu sword lady's personal shield had already disappeared. If such a fist were to strike the middle of her back, her durability would probably be greatly damaged. It was even possible for it to break. After all, this was a full-powered attack from a flood-level Yuan Ko filled with rage. When the small figure raised her fist, the Wangshu sword lady finally sensed that something was wrong behind her. She turned around in a panic, preparing to flee. However, it was already too late. She was so weak that she couldn't burst forth with her previous speed. She didn't even have the strength to re-enter the void to evade. All she could do was watch as the fist came smashing toward her. At that critical moment, a stream of sword light appeared between the Wangshu sword lady and the small figure. It was only then that the people on the city walls saw what had just happened. An ordinary-looking longsword had coincidentally struck the small fist. If the longsword had been one step slower, the Wangshu sword lady would probably have met with misfortune. "And who are you?" The one who spoke was dressed in a white and pink laced overgarment and miniskirt. She had a pair of thick legs that were thin at the bottom and thick at the top. She wore a pair of white cotton socks that went over her knees. She had a large square face, short silver-white hair tinged with pink, and bangs that looked like they were made of air. If it wasn't for the two silver-white dragon horns on her head and the tail that had a furry cotton ball attached to it, Gahan would definitely think that she was an ordinary and cute human lowly. He wouldn't have associated her with that terrifying lightning dragon. "She's too cute. My nose is about to bleed." When the sword bearers on the city walls saw the cute little lowly, some of them who were experienced lullicons couldn't hold back their excitement. Their noses started to bleed. Some of them even took out their medical pods to prevent themselves from collapsing from excessive blood loss. Even Gahan, who was standing opposite Kong Na, had to admit that she was indeed a very cute little lowly. Her cuteness was second only to his mischievous Qingpin. Unfortunately, there were many people in Yuzhong City who knew Qingpin, so Gohan had to force all his sword maidens into the dimensional pocket to avoid giving himself away. Hey, Kong Na wasn't discouraged when she saw her fist blocked by Gu Xianyuan. Instead, she raised her other fist and continued hammering at the Wangshu sword lady behind Gu Xianyuan. Gu Xianyuan blocked with the Zhu Xian sword once again knocking Kong Na's little fist back. She then turned to Lady Shu Jian and said, "Lady Shu Jian, you should go back. Not only will you not be able to help me, but you'll also be a hindrance. I'll have to divert my attention to protect you." "You?" The Wangshu sword lady was so infuriated by Gu Xuanyuan's words that her mouth became crooked. She was about to retort and insist on staying behind to continue battling this huge dragon. However, Sword Immortal Ling Su said, "Lady Shu Jian, please come down. We've already contributed enough to Yuzhong City. The rest will depend on the efforts of the people of Yuzhong City." Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su say this, the Wangshu sword lady harumphed indignantly. Then, she directly flew towards the core region. "You're not allowed to leave." Kong Na saw that the Wangshu sword lady was about to leave. How could she let her leave? Apart from being sealed by Lu Yinyua's ancestor, Kong Na had never suffered such a great injustice in her life. Thus, she immediately dispersed the void around her, wanting to chase after the Wangshu sword lady through the void and stop her. "You're not allowed to leave." Gu Xianyuan also said that she wasn't allowed to leave. However, Gu Xianyuan didn't have the ability to traverse the void like Kong Na and the Wangshu sword lady. Thus, she flew to the Wangshu sword lady's side at an extremely fast speed and escorted her back to the core region. This was because Gu Xianyuan knew that if Kong Na wanted to attack the Wangshu sword lady, she could only do so on the way. Otherwise, once the Wangshu sword lady entered the dimensional barrier, Kong Na wouldn't be able to touch the Wangshu sword lady before she broke through the barrier. Sure enough, Gu Xuanyuan's guess was correct. When the Wangshu sword lady was about 100 meters away from the dimensional barrier, Kong Na finally couldn't wait any longer and charged out of the void. She wanted to send the Wangshu sword lady flying out. However, Gu Xianyuan was a step faster than Kong Na. She blocked Kong Na's attack in advance. The short-legged lowly could only watch helplessly as the Wangshu sword lady entered the dimensional barrier. "How annoying," Kong Na said with a dark expression when she saw the person who had bullied her escape back into her turtle shell. Her surroundings were filled with angry electric sparks. In an instant, all these electric sparks shot towards Gu Xuanyuan's body. Gu Xianyuan recognized these electric sparks. They were the same electric sparks that had paralyzed the Wangshu sword lady. Although Gu Xianyuan had the immortal slaying sword in hand, her body constitution and resistance were far inferior to the Wangshu sword lady. In fact, Gu Xianyuan didn't even have her own personal shield. If she were to be struck by the sparks, she would probably immediately fall into an endless state of paralysis. 9 Swords of Mysterious Heaven, Sword of Spring. At this slightly urgent moment, Gu Xianyuan used the 9 Swords of Mysterious Heaven that she hadn't used in a long time. Although Gu Xuanyuan's greatest killing move was the incomplete Chaos Sword technique, it was still the best choice to deal with these electric sparks. The 9 Swords of Mysterious Heaven was the best choice to deal with these electric sparks. The immortal slaying sword formation emitted an umbrella-like sword chi, blocking all the electric sparks. Kang Na's first wave of attack against Gu Xianyuan was also fruitless. This is bad. Although Kang Na liked to say the words "this is bad," every "this is bad" actually contained different emotions. For example, the "this is bad" she had just said contained extreme displeasure. Kang Na's furry tail rose up, and countless electric sparks shot out from her tail, condensing into small crabs in the air. However, these crabs were all formed from the surging electric sparks. Electric barbecue. With Kang Na's command, the countless electric crabs hovering around her carried the attitude of wanting to electric barbecue Gu Xianyuan. They charged towards Gu Xianyuan from all directions. These electric crabs were like guided missiles. If any of them exploded near Gu Xianyuan, given her current state of not having a personal barrier, she would be roasted alive by these electric crabs. 9 Swords of Mysterious Heaven. Overlook Golden Chrysanthemum. The immortal slaying sword's blade swept horizontally, and a golden chrysanthemum formed by countless sword chi radiated with Gu Xianyuan as the center. The moment these golden chrysanthemums came into contact with the electric crabs, they were all chopped into small, sparkling electric sparks. These electric sparks were attached to Gu Xuanyuan's sword chi, making the originally golden Overlook golden chrysanthemum even more dazzling. Go! Gu Xianyuan snapped her fingers, and the Overlook golden chrysanthemum that absorbed the electric crabs turned around and shrouded Kang Na, who was hovering opposite. Oh, this is bad. Kang Na had never seen her electric crabs being absorbed by someone else's attack. For a moment, she was a little dumbfounded. She even forgot to enter the void to avoid the Overlook golden chrysanthemum. As a result, she was hit by the Overlook golden chrysanthemum. Crackle, crackle. The dazzling electric sparks that erupted from the Overlook golden chrysanthemum made it impossible for the other sword wielders to look directly at the battlefield. They could only use their hands to shield their eyes, lest the blinding electric sparks hurt their eyes. When the exploding electric sparks finally dissipated, everyone hurriedly opened their eyes. They discovered that Gu Xianyuan was completely unscathed in the air, and she still looked as content as ever. On the other side, Kang Na wasn't so well off. She no longer had the pure white and adorable lowly appearance from before. Instead, her body was riddled with tiny wounds from the sword chi, and pure white blood continued to flow from the wounds. Because of Sword Immortal Ling Su's attack just now, Kang Na had already lost a lot of dragon blood. Who would have thought that Gu Xuanyuan's attack would cause her to lose even more dragon blood? What made Kang Na feel even more humiliated was that her body was full of black and white burn marks from being electrocuted. This was probably the first time in her life that this little lowly had been electrocuted by her own electric crabs. Although the damage caused by the electric sparks was almost negligible to Kang Na, this kind of self-inflicted experience made her feel extremely uncomfortable. Who is this? How come I've never seen a sword mistress like this before? Seeing Gu Xuanyuan's spectacular battle, and how she had completely suppressed this dragon Rank Yuan Ko at the very beginning of the battle, the sword bearers went crazy. They began to desperately search for information on Gu Xianyuan, and the first reaction of these sword bearers was that this woman was at least an immortal sword rank sword mistress. That's right. I've searched countless times on my personal terminal, but I still can't find what this sword mistress looks like. The sword bearers who were in charge of watching on the city wall shook their heads in exasperation. They had just used their personal terminals to search for information on the sword mistress based on Gu Xuanyuan's appearance, but of course, didn't find anything. Do you guys think that this isn't a sword mistress, but a sword bearer? After many fruitless searches, someone finally came up with a more reliable theory. However, most of the sword bearers did not believe that the person Kang Na was fighting was a sword bearer. If the other party was really a sword bearer, then his swordsmanship was a little too terrifying. At this time, Li Xian was also standing on the city wall. He recognized Gu Xuanyuan's background at a glance, and he began to feel extremely fortunate that he hadn't harbored any ill intentions toward Gu Xuanyuan just now. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to reap any benefits from her. On the other hand, in the underground shelter, when Maiden, Long Xiaoya, Lu Anna, and the other tenants that Guhan hadn't seen for a long time were also watching all the battles that were happening on the battlefield through the shelter's television system in shock. "Mom, why do I feel that this woman looks very much like Master?" Long Xiaoya whispered to Wenmeiyan. After not appearing for more than 3 years, the current Long Xiaoya had already broken away from her immature and immature state. She had become a plump and attractive peach, just like her mother. Chapter 1103. Batty, Kang Na, with her jet black hair, pointed at Gu Xianyuan and scolded. Then, with a flash of lightning on her body, all the scars on her body disappeared in an instant, and Kang Na once again turned back into that lively and adorable pure white lowly. What a powerful, self-healing ability. Gu Xianyuan saw that Kang Na had returned to her original appearance in an instant and exclaimed in admiration. It couldn't be helped, as a flood-level Yuan Ko, and also a giant dragon with the strongest physique among the Yuan Ko, possessing such a self-healing ability was not a rare thing. But just having a self-healing ability isn't enough. You have to be able to keep up with my sword. Gu Xuanyuan's mouth revealed a trace of a cold smile. Kang Na, who had just returned to normal, had yet to react to what had happened, and in the next moment, Gu Xianyuan had already rushed to Kang Na's side, and the execute immortal sword in her hand directly chopped towards Kang Na's small neck. Kang Na hurriedly wanted to use her own fist to block the execute immortal sword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand. But the moment Kang Na's fist moved, the execute immortal sword in Gu Xuanyuan's hand nimbly changed its move and directly avoided Kang Na's fist, and the blade of the sword still chopped towards Kang Na's neck. Ouch! Kang Na cried out in pain, and in an instant, a deep milky white bloodstain appeared on her neck. This bloodstain was deeper and bigger than any of the wounds that Kang Na had received in the past, and this was also the first time that Kang Na had let out a cry of pain. From this, it could be seen that the damage caused to Kang Na by this sword was not to be underestimated. Big Batty, Kang Na will hammer you to death. Kang Na once again brandished her small fist and used a set of Kang Na's chaotic cloak fist technique, wanting to use her own fist to hammer Gu Xianyuan to death. Don't look at how Kang Na's fist was only the size of a juzi, but each of her fists carried the power of thousands of caddies. If one of her fists were to land on something, it was likely that it could directly bend a 1-meter-thick steel plate. As long as a fist truly landed on Gu Xuanyuan's body, Gu Xianyuan, who did not have the protection of a personal shield, would become half-crippled even if she didn't die. This is really a fist technique that only a little kid can use. With a glance, Gu Xianyuan knew that Kang Na's Kang Na brand chaotic cloak fist technique posed no threat to her. Although her fists were full of power, it was no different from the punches of a primary school student. However, it couldn't be said that Kang Na brand chaotic cloak fist technique was useless. At the very least, Kang Na's fists were very fast, so fast that ordinary people couldn't even see the afterimages, as if Kang Na's arms didn't exist. Break! Facing Kang Na's fist technique, Gu Xianyuan couldn't be bothered to use any sword techniques. She directly targeted a few of Kang Na's fatal flaws, and used the Zhu Xian sword to poke a few times. Kang Na's chaotic cloak wind fist technique was unable to continue, and she was directly sent flying by Gu Xuanyuan's sword. The pure white lowly appearance that she had just recovered became badly battered, and there were even a dozen wounds faintly appearing on her body. What happened just now? The other sword bearers on the city wall looked on with bewilderment. In their eyes, the battle was like this. Kong Na went up. Kong Na had a huge advantage. Kong Na was sent flying amidst the cheers and laughter. From start to finish, these sword-bearers couldn't even understand how Gu Xianyuan had used her sword. And Kong Na, who was sent flying, was not discouraged. She pounced at Gu Xianyuan again, and the two of them became entangled in the air. Because the speed of the battle between the two of them was really too fast, other than Sword Immortal Ling Su, who could just barely see some clues, the other sword-bearers couldn't see any details. They could only see Kong Na being sent flying again and then unyieldingly clashing with Gu Xianyuan again and again. Gu Xianyuan and Kong Na battled like this for about 8 hours, but the battle was still in a stalemate. The sword-bearers on the city wall were still watching with great interest in the first few minutes, but after a few minutes, their eyes felt unbearably tired. After a few more minutes, they completely lost interest in the battle in the sky, and could only helplessly pray in their hearts that the battle in the sky would quickly end. This is a competition of endurance between the two of them. Only Sword Immortal Ling Su kept his eyes fixed unwaveringly on the battle in the sky during these 8 hours, and he explained to the other sword-bearers beside him, "Young Mistress Gu Xuanyuan's swordsmanship is far more powerful than this giant dragon's, but this giant dragon's strength is also far above young Mistress Gu Xuanyuan's. The strengths of the two cancel each other out, so the two of them are in a stalemate for a while, and they are beginning to compete in endurance. The moment the physical strength of the one who can no longer hold on, the winner of this battle will be decided." Sword Immortal Ling Su concluded. "Then, my lord, who do you think will be the first to give up?" The surrounding sword-bearers immediately asked with concern. A microphone was also pointed at Sword Immortal Ling Su at the same time. This microphone belonged to the official television station of Yuzhong City. At a time like this, only the official television station with the strongest background had the ability to broadcast this difficult battle live. Not long after Gu Xianyuan and Kong Na fell into a stalemate, the official television station of Yuzhong City began to interview Sword Immortal Ling Su. At the same time, Sword Immortal Ling Su also temporarily took on the role of a commentator for the battle and began to explain the battle. It was also through Sword Immortal Ling Su that the others learned that this powerful sword-bearer who had suddenly appeared was called Gu Xianyuan. And the other end of this microphone was connected to the countless television series in the core area, as well as the underground sanctuary. Over 40 million people in Yuzhong City were waiting in front of their televisions at the same time, constantly praying in their hearts that this young Mistress Gu Xianyuan who had suddenly appeared would be able to save their Yuzhong City. Although I don't want to admit it, I have to say that the giant dragon has a higher chance of winning. Sword Immortal Ling Su sighed. After all, the opponent is a giant dragon. Its physical strength, endurance, and recovery ability are all incomparable to humans. If this continues, I'm afraid that young Mistress Gu Xianyuan will eventually run out of physical strength and retreat. Sigh, sigh, sigh. Hearing Sword Immortal Ling Su say this, tens of millions of sighs rang out at the same time in Yuzhong City. They all felt that Sword Immortal Ling Su was right. How could a human compete with a giant dragon in endurance? But soon, reality proved that Sword Immortal Ling Su's words were both right and wrong. He was right because after this extremely boring stalemate lasted for 8.5 hours, one party finally could no longer endure such a battle of endurance and jumped out of the battlefield. And he was wrong because the party who jumped out was not the Spirit Sword level swordbearer Gu Xianyuan, who was far weaker than her opponent, but Kong Na. This powerful flood stage Yuan Ko, who also had the recovery ability of a giant dragon. Kong Na, the Thunder Dragon, was the first to give up. After these 2.5 hours of fierce battle, Kong Na still looked like a clean and pure little lowly. But anyone with a discerning eye could see that Kong Na seemed to be a little unsteady even in her hovering state. Her body swayed like a drone with low battery and could fall from the sky at any time. Oh no! Kong Na fainted from hunger. Kong Na patted her little belly, and a gurgling sound like a tire deflating instantly rang through the entire sky. Not to mention the sword-bearers standing on the city wall. Even the ordinary people hiding in the underground shelters seemed to have heard the gurgling sound coming from the sky. No wonder it was this giant dragon who gave up in the end. Looks like she really can't stand the hunger anymore. Only then did the sword-bearers come to a sudden realization and began to discuss. They were just wondering why this giant dragon was the first to give up. It turned out that it was because she was hungry. It seemed that Miss Gu Xianyuan was really very lucky. In fact, these sword-bearers didn't know that Gu Xianyuan actually didn't use much strength in this battle. Throughout the whole process, Gu Xianyuan was using the 9 swords of mysterious heaven technique to borrow strength, to fight strength. Most of the strength she used in the battle with Kong Na just now came from Kong Na's own strength. Who asked this little lowly's fist technique to be a little too bad? If it weren't for the fact that the giant dragon's skin was too rough and thick, and that Gu Xianyuan was 2 ranks lower than her, Gu Xianyuan would have already played this little lowly to death. But what made Gu Xianyuan feel a little strange was why this little lowly kept fighting her in close combat. As a thunder and lightning dragon, thunder and lightning was what she was really good at. Just like how she used endless thunder and lightning to deal with Yuzhong City's dimensional barrier and those electric sparks that could paralyze people, thunder and lightning should be Kong Na's specialty. Why didn't she use what she was good at and fight with a disadvantage that she didn't know at all? At this time, the sky had already turned golden, which meant that the moon was about to pass and the sun would rise from the sky again. The battle between Gu Xianyuan and Kong Na had also lasted for a night. The sun gradually rose from behind Gu Xianyuan. Under the golden sunlight, coupled with Gu Xuanyuan's beautiful face, she was like a sun goddess. Every sword-bearer who saw this scene couldn't help but be intoxicated. At the same time, the image of Gu Xianyuan was deeply imprinted in their minds. Such a scene of the sun goddess was probably something they would never forget for the rest of their lives. Later, a few years later, a sword-bearer who was only in his 20s picked up a paintbrush and painted this scene in his heart. As a result, it became one of the most valuable paintings of mankind in one fell swoop. The price was constantly raised by later generations of humans, and its status was simply several levels higher than Van Gogh's sunflowers. It's time to end the battle. Gu Xianyuan shook the Zhu Xian sword in his hand. At the same time, he calculated the remaining sword essence in his body and found that there was still about 70% left. It was enough for him to use that move from the Chaos Sword Art. Gu Xianyuan was confident that as long as he used that move, even if the person in front of him was the powerful Yuan Ko, he would most likely lose his life here. Because this move was really too powerful. It was so powerful that Kanzu Fleeting Year Calendar, who helped him create this move, couldn't help but praise it. If Gohan could reach the peak of Fleeting Year Calendar's sword essence level, it would be impossible for Fleeting Year Calendar to take on this move. There was even a great chance that he would die under this move. This was not a move that should appear in the human world. This move was also the source of Gu Xuanyuan's confidence. Even if Gu Xianyuan didn't synchronize with the Zhu Xian sword, he was confident that he could use this move to repel Kong Na. Now that he had the Zhu Xian sword in his hand, Kong Na, this unlucky little lowly, would probably really die under Gu Xuanyuan's sword. In fact, Gu Xianyuan didn't want to expose this move too early. Whether it was for Yuan Ko or for the human race, it was not a good thing to expose this move now. Unfortunately, Yuzhong City was in danger, and there were hundreds of thousands of Yuan Ko's army coveting Yuzhong City. Gu Xianyuan didn't care about exposing his trump card. He only wanted to kill Kong Na as soon as possible, and then deal with the incoming Yuan Ko's army. Hun! Gue! Gu Xuanyuan's aura gradually rose to its peak. The sword essence in his body also poured into the Zhu Xian sword. This peerless move was about to explode. Oh no! I surrender. Kong Na suddenly put her hands under her skirt and took off her cotton underwear. She hung it high on the 2 silver horns on her head and said pitifully, I don't want to fight anymore. I surrender. This powerful river-level Yuan bandit actually surrendered. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.